in many countries around the world and across centuries of human history. The purpose of this book is to expose some of the more blatant misconceptions poisoning race relations in our time. The reasons for these misconceptions range from simple, innocent ignorance to reasons that are far from simple and far from innocent. Many of the facts cited here may be surprising or even startling to some readers, but they are not literally unknown to scholars. They have simply not been widely discussed in the media or even in academia. Too much has been assumed for too long, and too little has been scrutinized. It may be optimistic merely to suggest that racial or ethnic issues can be discussed rationally. Evidence to the contrary is all too abundant in the strident and sweeping condemnations directed against many who have tried to do so. Yet there is also evidence in recent years of a growing willingness to consider views that differ from the racial orthodoxy that has prevailed largely unchallenged from the 1960s onward in intellectual circles and in the popular media. In any event, these essays summarize the conclusions of more than a quarter of a century of my research on racial and cultural issues, as well as drawing on the work of innumerable other scholars around the world. These writings do not pretend to be definitive. If they provoke thoughts on a subject where cliches and dogmas too often prevail, then this book will have achieved one of its major goals. However, even a work seeking primarily to untangle a complex set of historic social issues can provoke the fashionable question, but what is your solution? Yet, there is not the slightest danger that there will be a shortage of solutions. On the contrary, an abundance of uninformed solutions has been one of our biggest social problems. Any serious consideration of social problems is likely to involve trade-offs rather than neat solutions. And trade-offs depend on values which can vary from one individual to the next. Black rednecks and white liberals. These people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job, they flout the law constantly and neglect their children, they drink too much, and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. This was said in 1956 in Indianapolis, not about blacks or other minorities, but about poor whites from the South. Nor was Indianapolis unique in this respect. A 1951 survey in Detroit found that white Southerners living there were considered undesirable by 21% of those surveyed, compared to 13% who ranked blacks the same way. In the late 1940s, a Chicago employer said frankly, "I told the guard at the plant gate to tell the hillbillies that there were no openings." When poor whites from the South moved into northern cities to work in war plants during the Second World War, occasionally a white Southerner would find that a flat or a furnished room had just been rented when the landlord heard his Southern accent. More is involved here than a mere parallel between blacks and Southern whites. What is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries, which has encompassed everything from ways of talking to attitudes toward education, violence, and sex, and which originated not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South. Then it largely died out among both white and black Southerners, while still surviving today in the poorest and worst of the urban black ghettos. It is not uncommon for a culture to survive longer where it is transplanted and to retain characteristics lost in its place of origin. The French spoken in Quebec and the Spanish spoken in Mexico contain words and phrases that have long since become archaic in France and Spain. Regional German dialects persisted among Germans living in the United States after those dialects had begun to die out in Germany itself. A scholar specializing in the history of the South has likewise noted among white Southerners archaic word forms, while another scholar has pointed out the continued use in that region of terms that were familiar at the time of the first Queen Elizabeth. The card game whist is today played almost exclusively by blacks, especially low-income blacks, though in the 18th century it was played by the British upper classes and has since then evolved into bridge. The history of the evolution of this game is indicative of a much broader pattern of cultural evolution in much more weighty things. Southern whites not only spoke the English language in very different ways from whites in other regions, Their churches, their roads, their homes, their music, their education, their food. The rednecks of these regions were what one social historian has called some of the most disorderly inhabitants of a deeply disordered land. In this world of impotent laws, daily dangers, and lives that could be snuffed out at any moment, the snatching at whatever fleeting pleasures presented themselves was at least understandable. Certainly, prudence and long-range planning of one's life had no such payoff in this chaotic world as in more settled and orderly societies under the protection of effective laws. Books, businesses, technology, and science were not the kinds of things likely to be promoted or admired in the world of the rednecks and crackers. Manliness and the forceful projection of that manliness to others, and advertising of one's willingness to fight and even to put one's life on the line, were at least plausible means of gaining whatever measure of security was possible in a lawless region and a violent time. The kinds of attitudes and cultural values produced by centuries of living under such conditions did not disappear very quickly, even when social evolution in North America slowly and almost imperceptibly created a new and different world with different objective prospects. What the rednecks or crackers brought with them across the ocean was a whole constellation of attitudes, values, and behavior patterns that might have made sense in the world in which they had lived for centuries, but which would prove to be counterproductive in the world to which they were going, and counterproductive to the blacks who would live in their midst for centuries before emerging into freedom and migrating to the great urban centers of the United States, taking with them similar values. The cultural values and social patterns prevalent among Southern whites included an aversion to work, proneness to violence, neglect of education, sexual promiscuity, improvidence, drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship, reckless searches for excitement, lively music and dance, and a style of religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery. This oratorical style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and has continued on into our own times among Black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization were also part of this redneck culture among people from regions of Britain where the civilization was the least developed. They boast and lack self-restraint, Olmsted said, after observing their descendants in the American antebellum South. While Professor Grady McWhiney's Cracker Culture is perhaps the most thorough historical study of the values and behavioral patterns of white Southerners, many other scholarly studies have turned up very similar patterns. Again, what is important here is not the isolated incident itself, but the set of social attitudes which allowed such incidents to take place publicly with impunity. The killer knowing in advance that what he was doing had community approval. Moreover, such attitudes went back for centuries on both sides of the Atlantic, at least among the particular people concerned. During the era when dueling became a pattern among upper-class Americans, between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, it was particularly prevalent in the South. As a social history of the United States noted, of Southern statesmen who rose to prominence after 1790, hardly one can be mentioned who was not involved in a duel. Editors of Southern newspapers became involved in duels so often that cartoonists depicted them with a pen in one hand and a dueling pistol in the other. Most duels arose not over substantive issues, but over words considered insulting. At lower social levels, Southern feuds such as that between the Hatfields and the McCoys, which began in a dispute over a pig and ultimately claimed more than 20 lives, became legendary. It has been estimated that, while at least 3/4 of the settlers in colonial New England originated in the lowland southeastern half of Britain, a similarly large proportion of the population of the South originated in the Scottish Highlands, Ireland, Wales, or the northern and western uplands of England. Those arriving from Ireland in colonial times would have been from Ulster County, where Scots and Englishmen settled, since substantial immigration of the indigenous Irish did not begin until near the middle of the 19th century. Radically different cultures could develop and persist during this era before transportation and communication developed, to the point of promoting widespread interactions among people in different regions. In colonial America, the people of the English borderlands and of the Celtic fringe were seen by contemporaries as culturally quite distinct and were socially unwelcome. Mob action prevented a shipload of Ulster Scots from landing in Boston in 1719, and the Quaker leaders of eastern Pennsylvania encouraged Ulster Scots to settle out in western Pennsylvania, where they acted as a buffer to the Indians, as well as being a constant source of friction and conflict with the Indians. It was not just in the North that crackers and rednecks were considered to be undesirables. Southern plantation owners with poor whites living on adjoining land would often offer to buy their land for more than it was worth in order to be rid of such neighbors. Because there were no racial differences to form separate statistical categories for these North Britons and for other whites who settled in the South, or in particular enclaves elsewhere, indirect indicators must serve as proxies for these cultural differences. Names are among these indicators. Edward, for example, was a popular name in Virginia, and in licentiousness was prevalent among them. Among their equals, the men were quarrelsome and inclined to crimes of violence. The poor whites were densely ignorant. Their labors tended to be intermittent, often when they were pressed for money rather than a steady employment career. Frederick Law Olmsted called it lazy poverty, with whatever work they did being done in a thoughtless manner. Summarizing his observations in the antebellum South, Olmsted said, "I know that while men seldom want an abundance of coarse food in the cotton states, the proportion of the free white men who live as well in any aspect as our working classes in the North, on an average, is small, and that the citizens of the cotton states, as a whole, are poor. They work little, and that little, badly. They earn little, they sell little, they buy little, and they have little, very little, of the common comforts and consolations of civilized life. Their destitution is not material only, it is intellectual, and it is moral." When Olmsted found work done efficiently, promptly, and well during his travels through the South, when he found well-run businesses, good libraries, impressive churches, and efficiently functioning institutions in general, he almost invariably found them to be run by Northerners, foreigners, or Jews. Nor was he the only visiting observer to reach such conclusions. Another observed that nearly all of the Old South's successful storekeepers were either Yankees or Yankee-trained Southerners. A French visitor said that when you saw a plantation in better condition than others, you would often discover that it was owned by someone from the North. A history of Southern agriculture presented this picture of North Carolina in the early 18th century. Many of the inhabitants were rough borderers who lived a crude, half-savage existence. Some were herdsmen, dependent mainly on the product of the range and under the necessity of eating meat without bread. There were also many thriftless and lazy families who had been attracted to the country by the mild climate and the ease with which a bare livelihood could be obtained by hunting and fishing, raising a little corn and keeping a few head of swine, and possibly a cow or two on the range. On the other hand, there were small farmers, many of Northern or European extraction, living industrious and thrifty lives amidst a rude abundance and considerable diversity of food supplies. They maintained good-sized herds of cattle, swine, and sheep, and the women made butter and cheese. Borderers, at that point, would refer to people from the borderlands of Britain, those included in what Professor McWhiney and others have called the Celtic fringe, and what Professor Fisher called North Britons. While the making of butter and cheese might seem to be an unremarkable activity in most rural communities, although the term lazy appears frequently in comments on these people on both sides of the Atlantic, there has been no evidence of any such aversion on their part to strenuous physical activity in dancing, fighting, hunting, and other recreational activities, so sloth was not the real issue. Nor have rednecks or crackers been prominent in such less physically demanding activities as entrepreneurship or scholarship. It is the nature of the particular activities in which they have taken an active interest and on which they have expended their energies, rather than the physical demands of those activities, that seems to have been crucial. Not only did many of the groups who settled in the South disdain business as a career, as their ancestors had in those parts of Britain from which they came, they typically lacked the kinds of habits necessary to be successful in business. Among the habits needed to run a business, none is more basic than a steady application to the tasks at hand, doing things in a businesslike way. But those relatively few Southerners who did run businesses often displayed no such businesslike attitudes. Even when there was business to transact, Southerners would often stop to go watch a cockfight or a parade, or visit a saloon or go hunting. In traveling in the South, a Northern visitor commented in the 1850s, "You become astonished at the little attention men pay to their business." Such views were not confined to Northerners, however, nor to urban businesses. According to a noted history of the antebellum South, the Richmond Enquirer attributed the success of Northern farmers where Southerners had failed to the social nature of the latter, which led them to gather round the courthouse and country stores to smoke, chew, talk politics, and in general, to waste time. Many Southern businessmen were unreliable about either paying their bills or delivering goods and services when promised. Among Southerners in general, their improvident spending and the indebtedness to which it often led was widely commented on in the United States and in the places from which their ancestors came in Britain. Even large Southern plantation owners with lavish lifestyles were often deeply in debt. Among the Virginia gentry, extravagant and even ruinous bets on horses were common, according to a scholarly study. Nor were Southerners alert to profitable investment prospects, according to observers in the antebellum South. For example, although there were large coal deposits and a beautiful quality of marble near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the people there bought coal from Philadelphia, and marble for tombstones was imported from Italy. In antebellum Virginia as well, Olmsted observed the natural resources of the land were strangely unused or were used with poor economy. Nor was he alone in that conclusion. A 20th century scholar also commented on the coal available in Alabama, and there were no institutions comparable to New England's town schools. Although the white population of the South was only one half as large as that of the North, the total number of illiterate whites in the South in 1850 was larger than the total number of illiterates in the North. In the antebellum era, the total circulation of Northern newspapers was more than 4 times the total circulation of Southern newspapers. Moreover, many editors of Southern newspapers were themselves from the North. The North had 4 times as many schools, attended by more than 4 times as many pupils. Children in Massachusetts spent more than twice as many years in school as children in Virginia. When it came to inventions, only 8% of the patents issued in 1852 went to residents of the Southern states, whose white population was approximately 1/3 of the white population of the country. Even in agriculture, the main economic activity of the region, only 9 out of 62 patents for agricultural implements went to Southerners. The cotton gin, perhaps the most crucial invention for the antebellum South, was invented by a Northerner. A Southerner said to Frederick Law Olmsted, "The fact is, sir, the people here are not like you Northern people. They don't reason out everything so." Olmsted himself likewise concluded from his travels in the antebellum South that Southerners were greatly disinclined to exact and careful reasoning. As late as the First World War, white soldiers from Georgia, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Mississippi scored lower on mental tests than black soldiers from Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania. At higher levels of achievement, the contrast between the South and other regions was even more stark. A study of leading American figures in the arts and sciences in the first half of the 19th century found most clustered in the Northeast, while vast regions of the South, Virginia alone excepted, were without a single one. The kinds of statistical disparities found between Southern whites and Northern whites in the past are today often taken as evidence or proof of racial discrimination when such disparities are found between the Black and white populations of the country as a whole, while others have taken such disparities as signs of genetic deficiencies. Yet clearly, neither racial discrimination nor racial inferiority can explain similar differences between whites in the North and the South in earlier centuries. This should at least raise questions about such explanations when applied to Blacks of a later era who inherited the culture of white Southerners. Sexual activity. Southern whites were as different from Northern whites when it came to sexual patterns as they were in other ways. Widespread casual sex was commented on by outside observers in both the Americas. One of the strangest sights to a New England man on visiting Southern states is the desecration of the Sabbath, wrote a Yankee. In some of the cities, especially if a good number of the businessmen are from the North, the churches are tolerably well attended, there being but one sermon for the day. But even here, the afternoon and evening are much devoted to amusements. Another Northerner declared that in the South, there is no Sabbath. They work, run, swear, and drink here on Sundays just as they do on any other day of the week. Many Southerners did not go to church at all, or did so intermittently, or when not distracted by other activities. Again, this was a pattern found among their ancestors in Britain. Among the reasons given by contemporaries for low church attendance among Southerners was that they often got drunk on Saturday night and were in no condition to go to church on Sunday morning. Black rednecks. Much of the cultural pattern of Southern rednecks became the cultural heritage of Southern blacks, more so than survivals of African cultures with which they had not been in contact for centuries. Even in colonial times, most blacks on American soil had been born on American soil. Moreover, such cultural traits followed blacks out of the southern countrysides and into the urban ghettos, north and south, where many settled. The very way of talking, later to be christened Black English, closely followed dialects brought over from those parts of Britain from which many white Southerners came, though these speech patterns died out in Britain while surviving in the American South, as such speech patterns would later die out among most Southern whites and among middle-class blacks, while surviving in the poorer black ghettos around the country. For example, where a Northerner said, "I am," "you are," "she isn't," "it doesn't," and "I haven't," a Virginian, even of high rank, preferred to say, "I be," "you be," "she ain't," "it don't," and "I ain't." These Virginia speechways were not invented in America. They derived from a family or regional dialects that had been spoken throughout the South and West of England during the 17th century. From these same regions of England came such words as yaller for yellow, axe for ask, acrost for across, y'all for you, bile for boil, do for door, dis for this, and that for that. Many of these usages have long since died out in England, though the word chitlins for hog entrails continued to be used in some localities in England, even in the 20th century, as such usage remained common among Black Americans. But no such words came from Africa, nor did the holiday Kwanzaa, which originated in Los Angeles. The slaves' custom of marking their marriages by jumping over a broomstick, a custom resurrected at a pop, as already noted. Black soldiers from some northern states scored higher on mental tests than whites from some southern states during the First World War. From that same era, European immigrants from cultures where education was not a high priority for ordinary people, parts of Eastern and Southern Europe, for example, scored no higher on mental tests than American blacks, and, in some communities, their children scored lower than Northern Black children attending the same schools. The low test scores of some European immigrant children cannot be automatically attributed to their being new to the United States. There have been settled communities of whites with test scores similar to those of blacks, where these have been culturally isolated people, such as the inhabitants of the Hebrides Islands off Scotland, or people living in Tennessee mountain communities, hillbillies, or inhabitants of canal boat communities in Britain. In short, some kinds of cultures tend to produce lower mental test scores, whether the people in those cultures are Black or white, American or European. As someone has aptly said, the tests are not unfair. Life is unfair, and the tests measure the results. No one chooses which culture to be born into, or can be blamed for how that culture evolved in centuries past. In business ownership, as in other ways, the pattern among Black Americans has followed the pattern of rednecks in earlier times, with people from other groups owning most of the businesses in Black neighborhoods. Some may try to explain the lack of locally owned businesses in the ghettos by racial discrimination or poverty, but as early as the 1920s, there were numerous Black-owned businesses in Harlem, the majority of which were owned by Blacks from the Caribbean, not Blacks from the American South, who were the majority population of Harlem. Although New York was the principal destination of blacks from the Caribbean, then as now, the 1930 census showed that there were more than 4 times as many native-born blacks in Manhattan as there were foreign-born blacks. In a parallel to differences between Southern and non-Southern whites, a study of West Indian blacks in the United States noted that the Negro immigrants, particularly the British West Indians, bring a zest of learning that is not typical of the native-born population. While Black Americans have long been overrepresented among people in prison, a study of the racial composition of New York State's Sing Sing prison in the early 1930s found that Black West Indians were underrepresented relative to their share of the population, at a time when native-born Black Americans were overrepresented several-fold among Sing Sing inmates. During that same era, when American-born Black women and West Indian Black women both worked in New York City's garment district, the latter were more frequently found at the skilled tasks. More generally, the study found that the Black immigrant brings a cultural heritage that is vastly different from that of the American. By 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended, there were about 1,400 Northern white teachers from dozens of religious missionary associations teaching Black children in 975 Southern schools. The numbers suggesting that these were mostly the kinds of one-room schoolhouses common at the time in rural areas, which is where most Southern Blacks lived. Just a few years later, at the end of the decade, there were more than 2,500 Northern teachers in just over 2,000 schools for Black children. A sample of about 1,000 of these teachers, whose origins could be traced, showed that more than 500 came directly from New England, and the others are believed to include people born in New England, but who came south directly from some other location. To put this in perspective, only 17% of the Northern population lived in New England at the time. So this was a wholly disproportionate representation of New Englanders among those who began to educate newly emancipated Blacks. This was a New England-led crusade, much like the pre-war abolitionist movement, and many of those who went into the postbellum South were former abolitionists. These teachers brought a wholly different culture into the South. In the words of distinguished Black scholar E. Franklin Frazier, the missionaries from New England who founded the first schools for Negroes in the South left the imprint of their Puritan background upon Negro education. In addition to strict morality, these missionaries taught the Yankee virtues of industry and thrift. This cultural transformation was not incidental. The avowed purpose of the American Missionary Association was to transplant a different culture into the school and college enclaves which they established among young Blacks in the South, in order to deliberately supplant the existing culture. These were deeply religious institutions, but in the New England sense, so that Black students were not to indulge in the religious emotionalism of the Black masses in the South. They were to be different in many other ways, as E. Franklin Frazier noted. First, students were taught to speak English correctly, and thus avoid the ungrammatical speech and dialect of the Negro masses. They were expected to be courteous, speak softly, and never exhibit the spontaneous boisterousness of ordinary Negroes. The casual Southern attitude toward sex was not tolerated. To be detected in immoral sex behavior, especially if the guilty person was a woman, meant expulsion from the school. The American Missionary Association was quite explicit in their desire to remove Black youngsters from their existing culture and place them in enclaves of the culture transplanted from the North. In an 1882 essay titled Change of Environment, Dr. W. W. Patton, president of the AMA, lamented that many Black children grow up in communities of prevailing ignorance, superstition, and immorality. In essence, most of this highly successful school's principals during its early formative period had New England educations and a New England culture, whether or not they received that education in New England itself. A wholly disproportionate share of future Black leaders came out of the schools and colleges established by New Englanders in the South, not even counting Oberlin College or Dunbar High School. These alumni of institutions founded as New England enclaves in the South included W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Walter White, Mary McLeod Bethune, A. Philip Randolph, James Farmer, Thurgood Marshall, and Martin Luther King, Jr. In addition to these individuals from these Southern institutions, the first black man to graduate from Annapolis, the first black woman to earn a PhD, the first black general, the first black cabinet member, and the first black federal judge all came from the same public high school, Dunbar High School in Washington, with its culturally New England educated principles in its formative years. Such concentrations of black pioneers and leaders in a few highly atypical cultural enclaves suggests that their achievements were not solely a matter of individual ability, cream rising to the top, but were also a result of a culture very unlike that in which most blacks were raised and educated. However much the achievements of these individuals have been celebrated, the culture behind those achievements has not been. Today, the culture that is celebrated in much of the media and in the schools is not the culture that succeeded, but the culture that has failed, the black redneck culture. When white couples who adopt black children are warned to be sure to put those children in touch with their cultural heritage, all too often that means the black redneck culture. Internal cultural differences. Internal cultural differences among blacks have long been extreme, ranging from such things as urbanization, education, and regional distribution, to rates of crime, economic achievement, and general acculturation to the norms of the surrounding society. Historically, the most fundamental difference for many generations was between those blacks who were slaves and those who were free. They differed not only in their legal status, but also in their regional distribution, their degree of urbanization, and even biologically. There were free blacks as far back as the 17th century. In fact, there were free blacks before there were slaves in America. The first Africans brought in captivity to colonial Virginia in 1619 became indentured servants, like the white indentured servants who were common in colonial America. Only later, with the mass importation of Africans, did this change. The first law in America recognizing the more prosperous of these families were able to educate their own children, sometimes through college, and these were typically lighter-skinned people, as well as people with generations of a head start in freedom and acculturation, as compared to the mass of enslaved blacks. The net result was that the elite among American Negroes tended to be, and to remain for generations after emancipation, a racially mixed group that married among themselves and formed a socially exclusive class. Among 19th century Negroes in Philadelphia, for example, 85% of mulatto men married mulatto women, and 93% of black men married black women. This was not solely a matter of color prejudice, for there were major behavioral differences between the two groups. The mulatto neighborhoods had lower crime rates and a higher percentage of their children attending school, as compared to the black neighborhoods, even though it can hardly be claimed that school attendance or crime rates are genetically predetermined. In short, there were major cultural differences, and these differences in turn produced other differences, such as a higher occupational status, better housing, and more wealth among the mulattoes. Nor was this pattern confined to Philadelphia. All across the country, North and South, the elite of the Negro community were lighter in complexion than the masses, and very self-conscious and sometimes snobbish about that fact. This remained so through at least the first half of the 20th century. Among the consequences of the extreme range of education and acculturation within the Negro community has been the larger society's erection of racial barriers provoked by black rednecks, which barriers then deeply offended those individuals at the other end of the cultural spectrum. These barriers, based on race, prevented cultural elites from separating themselves as much as they would like from lower class blacks, with whom they were forced to live in proximity and to share institutions. Yet protests against racial barriers had to be made in the name of all, light or dark, leading to charges of hypocrisy against the elites who spearheaded protests against white social and economic barriers, while maintaining their own social and economic barriers against the black lower class. That internal social barriers within the black community became more pronounced at the same time as white barriers against blacks in general suggests that more than coincidence was involved, since both occurred in the wake of the mass arrival of black rednecks from the South. Among the behavioral differences between the black elites and the black masses was that the elites had more stable families, with separation or divorce being rare among them. It took more than money or a light complexion to enter the social circles of the Black elite. Behavioral standards were also essential, and individuals who met these standards could be admitted with little money. Residential segregation was not the only retrogression in race relations during this period. In some northern and midwestern cities where schools had been racially integrated for years, Black children were now segregated from white children after the mass influx of Blacks from the South. Blacks in Washington were no longer allowed in white theaters, restaurants, or hotels, and their opportunities to work in white-collar occupations shrank. W.E.B. Du Bois summarized these retrogressions this way: "Yet it has everywhere been manifest in the long run that while a part of the Negroes were native-born and trained in the culture of the city, the others were immigrants, largely ignorant and unused to city life. There were, of course, manifold exceptions, but this was the rule. Thus, the history of the Negro in northern cities is the history of the rise of a small group by accretion from without, but at the same time, periodically overwhelmed by them and compelled to start over again when once the material had been assimilated." In Philadelphia, for example, the native-born Blacks had advanced, but, according to Du Bois, they were overwhelmed and dragged back by Black migrants from the South. He added, "In New York, the native-born have been perhaps even more completely overwhelmed." This pattern is confirmed in places where the retrogression in race relations took place at a different time because of local differences in the timing of large-scale in-migration of Blacks from the South. In San Francisco, for example, that mass influx took place during the Second World War, as Blacks from the South were attracted by jobs in new war production facilities, notably the Kaiser shipyards. Henry Kaiser recruited Southern Blacks and brought them to the San Francisco Bay Area by the trainloads. The Black population of San Francisco, which had been less than 5,000 in 1940, rose to more than 40,000 by the time of the 1950 census, and the Black populations of Oakland and Berkeley also rose several-fold during the same decade. In the San Francisco Bay Area, as in the northern cities half a century earlier, there was a long-settled Black population which lived free of the Jim Crow laws and practices of the South, and which had been able to get civil service jobs as far back as the 1920s. But although the newcomers were skilled workers more often than the local Black residents, culturally, the newcomers lagged far behind. Native-born Blacks in the Bay Area described the newcomers as foreign in the way they talked and in their behavior. For example, eating hamburgers openly on the bus, and bologna, and loud talking and fighting on the buses. That never happened in the old days. Some of the new Blacks from the South were described as having a little more of a chip on their shoulder than the people out here did. Many local Blacks thought that white racism increased after World War II, when both Southern Black blaming others. Blaming others for anything in which Blacks lag has become standard operating procedure among white liberals. If Blacks do not pass bar exams or medical board tests as often as whites or Asians, then that shows that something is wrong with those tests, as far as many white liberals are concerned. Best-selling author Andrew Hacker, for example, says that academic problems in general are created for Black students in white colleges because such colleges use curricula that are white in logic and learning, in their conceptions of scholarly knowledge and demeanor. Why this does not seem to be a problem for Asian students remains unexplained, even though Blacks have lived in this white society for centuries longer than either Asian Americans or contemporary immigrants from Asia. Why it is not a problem for Blacks from the Caribbean is another unexplained contradiction of such white liberal excuses for American-born Blacks. If Black attorneys are not elevated to partnerships and law firms in proportion to their numbers, then to the New York Times, this shows, in the words of their front page headline, law firms are slow in promoting minority lawyers to partner role. Apparently, there can only be external reasons for anything negative that happens to Blacks. According to Andrew Hacker, the fact that white taxi drivers often pass up Black males seeking a ride, especially at night, shows these drivers to be patently racist, even though Black taxi drivers do the same in order to avoid becoming victims of crime. White liberals long denied that there were higher crime rates among Blacks by pointing to the imperfections of crime statistics in general, or, more specifically, claiming that blacks are simply arrested more often for things that whites would not be arrested for. But if the imperfections of crime statistics were the real problem, then discussions could be limited to murder statistics, since dead bodies are not ignored, whether they are black or white, and neither are murderers, whatever their race. But murder statistics show the same disproportionate number of crimes by blacks as other statistics do. While murder statistics might provide more accuracy, they would not provide white liberals with a means of evading the obvious. Riots by blacks are almost automatically blamed on whites, whether in the Kerner Report on the riots of the 1960s or in the reactions among white liberals to the Los Angeles riots of 1992. In some white liberal circles, the New York Times, for example, the police are almost automatically at fault in confrontations with black criminals, hoodlums, or rioters. When the police arrive on a scene of crime or violence in black communities, whatever they do is likely to be categorized later as either having let the situation get out of hand or as having used excessive force. Any force sufficient to prevent the situation from getting out of hand is almost certain to be called excessive force by white liberals in the media, so that, by definition, the police will have acted badly. The notion that the ghetto black was the authentic black not only spread among both white and black intellectuals, it had social repercussions far beyond the intellectual community. Rooting black identity in a counterproductive culture not only reduced incentives to move beyond that culture, it cut off those within that culture from other blacks who had advanced beyond it, who might otherwise have been sources of examples, knowledge, and experience that could have been useful to those less fortunate. But more successful blacks were increasingly depicted as either irrelevant non-members of the black community or even as traitors to it. In turn, this meant that many blacks who had a wider cultural exposure and greater socioeconomic success felt a need to conform, to some degree or another, to a more narrow ghetto view of the world, perhaps using ghetto language in order to prove their identity with their own race. Such social pressures become especially acute for young blacks in the schools and colleges. One consequence of this has been that counterproductive attitudes toward education have filtered upward into black middle-class young people raised in racially integrated middle-class communities such as Shaker Heights, who spend less time on their studies than their white or Asian American classmates, under the overhanging threat of being accused of acting white if they devote themselves to their studies instead of to various social activities in which other black students indulge. The painful irony is that those who make this accusation are themselves acting white when they perpetuate a redneck culture from a bygone era. Even such a modern ghetto creation as gangster rap echoes the violence, arrogance, loose sexuality, and self-dramatization common for centuries in white redneck culture, and speaks in exaggerated cadences common in the oratory of rednecks in both the antebellum South and those parts of Britain from which their ancestors came. It is not only the cultural peculiarities of the black ghetto culture which has been perpetuated by the identity fetish developed in the post-1960s era. What has also been promoted has been a conformity of beliefs and affirmations among blacks, with those with different viewpoints being banished from consideration intellectually and ostracized socially, at least insofar as identity advocates succeed in imposing their straitjacket on others. Not only behavioral litmus tests, but ideological litmus tests have been used by those promoting a black identity fetish, with those who do not pass such litmus tests being dismissed as not really black. This post-1960s black identity intolerance, promoted by white intellectuals as well as black leaders and activists, is a painful parallel to the post-1830s intolerance among white Southerners against anyone who questioned slavery in any way. Maintaining what has been, are Jews generic? In any given country, a particular minority may be hated for any number of reasons peculiar to that country or that group. However, in a worldwide perspective, the most hated kinds of minorities are often not defined by race, color, religion, or national origin. Often, they are generically middleman minorities, who can be of any racial or ethnic background, and in fact, are of many. Many of the historic outbreaks of interethnic mob violence on a massive scale have been against the Jews in Europe, the Chinese minorities in various Southeast Asian countries, against the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, the Igbos in Nigeria, and against other middleman minorities in other times and places. While many kinds of minorities have been persecuted and subjected to violence, the sheer magnitude and duration of the persecution and violence unleashed against middleman minorities eclipses that unleashed against other kinds of groups. Conquered Aborigines or formerly enslaved groups, for example, might be held in greater contempt, but lethal animosities on a mass scale have been particularly often directed at middleman minorities. The mass slaughter of tens of thousands of Igbos in mob attacks in Nigeria, and the horrors inflicted on the Vietnamese boat people, most of whom were ethnically Chinese, have been reminiscent of the pogroms against the Jews in Eastern Europe. And the term genocide has been used to characterize what happened to the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, as well as to the Jews under the Nazis a generation later. Smaller violent rampages against the businesses, homes, or persons of middleman minorities have been common around the world, whether directed against the Lebanese in Sierra Leone, the Japanese in Peru, the Indians in Burma, or the Chinese in Southeast Asia. Other kinds of minorities have, of course, also suffered violence, but the scale of lethal mass violence against middleman minorities has been unequaled. All the blacks lynched in the entire history of the United States do not add up to as many people as the number of Chinese slaughtered by mobs near Saigon in 1782, or the Jews killed by mobs in Central Europe in 1096, or in the Ukraine in 1648, much less the slaughters of Armenians by mobs in the Ottoman Empire during the 1890s or during the First World War. Only the Nazi Holocaust exceeded the slaughter of Armenians, and while the Holocaust was the ultimate catastrophe for Jews, it was also the culmination of a long history of lethal mass violence unleashed against middleman minorities around the world. What do all these groups have in common, and why have they been hated so much? Partly the resentments and animosities against these groups have derived from the economic role they play, a role that has been widely misunderstood and widely resented in very disparate societies over a period of many centuries. It is not just what these minorities have achieved, but how they have achieved it that evokes suspicions and resentments. Throughout most of the history of the human race, most people have made a living in agriculture, typically through arduous labor. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution meant, for most people, the transfer of the scene of that arduous labor from farm to factory. To such people, those who earned their livings without visible toil, with clean hands, and by simply selling things that others had produced at higher prices than the producers had charged, were ready targets of resentments, especially when these non-producers enjoyed a higher standard of living than those who worked in factories or on farms. It did not have to be a dramatically higher standard of living. Those nearby on the socioeconomic scale are often more hotly resented than distant rich people. Just as there are those who believe that only workers who handle tangible physical objects in the production process are really producing output, so they believe that middlemen who physically produce nothing are merely parasites who insert themselves gratuitously between the real producers and the consumers. If this crude misconception seems like too little to account for so many centuries of hostility and violence against so many groups that are typically nonviolent themselves, it is nevertheless at the core of animosities that have endured even after most members of middleman minorities have moved on to professional careers in medicine, law, and other fields. The economic fallacy. Even in the absence of differences in toil or reward, the seeming conjuring of wealth out of thin air, apparently by overcharging others or making them pay back more money than was lent, has been seen as parasitic activity rather than as a contribution to the well-being of the community. Suspicions are readily aroused against an occupation where an income is generated, in Friedrich Hayek's words, out of nothing, without physical creation and by merely rearranging what already exists. An operation that to the uninitiated seems to stink of sorcery. Demagogues can easily supply theories that play upon this pre-existing suspicion and misapprehension. However, even in the absence of demagogues or of ethnic differences, the economic role alone can generate negative reactions. An often cited economist's account of rudimentary economic activities within a prisoner of war camp in Germany during World War II showed the economic and social role of middlemen among the men in the camp. Prisoners of war were fed by their captors, while monthly shipments of Red Cross packages supplemented their food and provided a few amenities like chocolates and cigarettes. All prisoners received the same material goods, but of course they valued different items differently. Non-smokers traded cigarettes for chocolates. Sikhs among the prisoners traded away canned beef for jam or margarine. According to a history of the Jews in the United States, staggering numbers of Jews in the decades before and after the Civil War first experienced America through peddling, which became the nearly universal American Jewish male experience. While Jewish peddlers worked as isolated individuals, their supplies came from a wider network. Each peddler functioned in a long Jewish economic chain, linking shopkeepers to Jewish wholesalers in the larger cities on whom they depended for credit. The Jewish peddler on the road served as the agent of the Jewish town shopkeeper and the big city jobber. This trading network depended on intra-communal trust. Wholesaler and peddler understood each other, spoke the same language, and knew the same people. Jewish wholesalers in port cities from New York to San Francisco supplied Jewish peddlers with merchandise which they carried on their backs into the hinterlands, to farmers, miners, railroad crews, and others working far from the big cities, and often in places where there were few or no stores. Peddlers, of course, also worked in cities and in every region of the country, from the southern plantations to the California mining camps where Levi Strauss first began to sell the rugged trousers that were to make his name famous. While Jewish peddlers often worked in isolation among a non-Jewish population, they were nevertheless tied to a wider Jewish community, not only by commercial ties to Jewish wholesalers and manufacturers, but also to family members in Europe and America. They often saved money to pay for transatlantic passage for relatives in Europe to come and join them. These savings at some point also allowed the peddler to set up a little shop in town, settle down, get married, and raise a family. The wives and children then worked in the same little business. Often the Jewish shopkeeper or other small businessmen and his family lived above or behind the store. Milton Friedman's family lived this way when he was growing up, a pattern that he described as common among the immigrants to America in that era. Yet this pattern was by no means confined to Jews or to America. Similar economic and social patterns could be found among the Lebanese in Sierra Leone and among other middlemen minorities in other parts of the world. The overseas Chinese storekeeper in the Philippines was likewise willing to live in a small corner of his store. As among the Jews, Lebanese children were initiated into their family businesses in the United States, as were the children of other middleman minorities in other countries. Whereas a minority of sons and daughters peddled at an early age, many, perhaps the majority of store owners' children, were prepared for life behind a counter. School-aged children, when not in school, were at their parents' elbows, waiting on customers, making change, stocking shelves, and imbibing the shrewdness of operating an independent business on meager resources. They were inculcated with the parents' work and thrift ethics, and the lesson that family unity and self-denial was essential to the family's goals. Economic success. Armenians are among the middlemen minorities who have worked their way up in various countries around the world. Armenians were very poor peasants for centuries in the Ottoman Empire. Over time, however, they evolved from rural entrepreneurs to urban entrepreneurs and financiers in Istanbul. Previously, they had directed the transit trade with Persia from Erzurum and eastern Armenia, but gradually they established themselves along the route from Persia to Istanbul. They were found in Sivas and Tokat, centers of agricultural production, in Ankara, center for sheep's wool and goat's wool, Tiftik, in Bursa, center for silk and tobacco, and in Iskandar, the Istanbul bridgehead in Asia and the destination of trade from Anatolia and Persia. Together with European merchants, they played an increasing role in this trade. Certain Armenians reached significant positions in commerce and finance, for their names appear in lists of money changers and bankers. In the 18th century, they were the most important minority merchants in the capital. Both as peasants and as businessmen, Armenians were noted for sobriety and thrift. In the process of becoming the most important middleman minority in Istanbul, the Armenians displaced the Jews in that role. Armenians were also prominent as traders in Iran. In Iran in the 17th century, Armenians dominated the Persian external trade and much of the internal commerce, their activity stretching from Europe to India. It has not been at all uncommon for groups whose background was in farming to go on to become middleman minorities, as the Armenians did. West African farmers, for example, have long engaged in trade as part of the marketing of their agricultural produce. Indigenous middleman minorities, such as the Igbo in Nigeria, were thus not fundamentally different initially in skills or wealth from the farmers with whom they interacted, despite attempts to contrast the productive farmer and the unproductive middleman who exploits him. P.T. Bauer's landmark study of West African trade found this pattern. The rapacious and unproductive middleman in primary producing countries is often unfavorably contrasted with the allegedly more deserving farmer. This contrast is misleading. It neglects the fact that as long as entry is free, the middleman is unlikely to secure an excessive income, since this would quickly attract competitors. Perhaps more important, the dichotomy is a false one. More often, the real distinction is not between the producer and the middleman, but between unenterprising, indolent, unambitious, and perhaps thriftless individuals, and others more venturesome, energetic, resourceful, and frugal. The small-scale produce buyer or village trader is quite often the farmer who thinks the effort worthwhile to collect and market his neighbor's produce or to cater for their simple requirements. People have literally died of starvation in the interior while food supplies rotted on the docks in port cities. In other economies, both production and consumption suffer from a lack of credit. More to the point, mass expulsions of supposedly parasitic middleman minorities have created shortages, higher prices, and rising interest rates in a number of countries and a number of periods of history. Being a middleman involves more than retailing. There are also middlemen who buy up agricultural produce that is an ingredient in industrial production, cotton, for example, rather than simply something to be resold directly to consumers. Often, especially in third world countries, this means buying small amounts from many farmers and combining all these small amounts in order to be able to sell in larger quantities to one or a few commercial or industrial firms. The money-lending function of middlemen can often be combined with both retailing, by selling to consumers on credit, or combined with buying raw produce, by advancing money to farmers to be repaid at harvest time. The Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Lebanese in West Africa, and the Indians in East Africa have been involved in all these various middleman activities. Some middlemen minorities, such as the Chettiars, specialize in money lending as such, but many middlemen minorities become involved in extending credit or loans as part of their buying and selling of consumer goods or agricultural produce. Middleman minorities have often been accused of taking over large portions of a country's economy, even in situations where it was they who largely or solely created particular businesses and industries. Many sectors of the local economy simply did not exist before the Chinese arrived in various countries in Southeast Asia, or the Lebanese in West Africa, or the Gujaratis from India and South Africa. But whatever the historical origins of particular occupations or industries, middleman minorities have often been represented in them out of all proportion to their numbers in the general population, whether while they were still middleman minorities or in later generations when they moved into other professions, businesses, and industries. On the eve of the First World War, for example, Jews were 60% of all the merchants in Hungary, despite being only 6% of the population. By 1920, they were also half of all lawyers and 3/5 of all doctors. On the eve of Hitler's coming to power in Germany, Jews owned 60% of wholesale and retail clothing businesses in the country. In the late 19th century, Jews owned 80% of all retail clothing stores in New York City and 90% of the wholesale clothing trade. The economic dominance of the overseas Chinese in various Southeast Asian countries has been even greater. Although less than 5% of the Indonesian population, the Chinese have controlled an estimated 70% of the country's private domestic capital and have run 3/4, even in the early years of Jewish poverty in the United States. Those in America managed to send money back to family members in Eastern Europe, not only for subsistence, but also to pay for their passage to the United States. These international transfers of wealth, though large in the aggregate, were no net reduction of the wealth of the country from which they were sent, because the middleman minorities had already added to the pre-existing wealth of the countries in which they settled, and were sending abroad only a fraction of that net addition. The central role of families, Their cohesiveness, cooperation, and loyalties has long been a common denominator among middleman minorities around the world. Their successes have not been simply the individual successes of cream rising to the top in isolation, though such groups have in fact turned out many remarkable individuals in many fields. Other groups, without the same strong and stable family backgrounds found among middleman minorities, have succeeded disproportionately in those few areas where purely individual talents are the overriding factors, such as sports and entertainment. In the United States, the Irish in the 19th century and blacks in the 20th century became spectacularly successful in boxing and baseball, as well as among singers and other entertainers, despite their lagging behind other groups in business, science, and other fields with more prerequisites of cultural or social capital. Both the 19th century Irish and the 20th century blacks were noted for high rates of broken families, violence, alcoholism, and crime. It is hardly surprising that both groups succeeded, not only as well as others, but far more so than most others, in fields where only the individual's abilities mattered. Such fields attracted a disproportionate share of their most able and ambitious young people, who often lacked the social prerequisites for widespread success in other fields. While intergroup comparisons have been discouraged by the taboo against blaming the victim, blame is in fact irrelevant. Certainly no individual or group has any control over the past from which their social and cultural legacy has come. What intergroup comparisons can tell us is which things have turned out to produce what results under what circumstances. If nothing else, that can warn us against blind alleys and counterproductive efforts, and against demagogues who would lead the young especially into those blind alleys and into self-destructive attitudes and behavior. Patterns within groups. Commercial, as well as family ties, have been strong within various middleman minorities. German Jewish businesses were among the main employers of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who arrived in the United States during the late 19th century. Even earlier, Jewish peddlers were able to get goods to sell on credit from more substantial Jewish businesses, not only in the United States, but also in Latin America. Among the Lebanese who settled in Australia, their regional loyalty seldom extended beyond that of the village in Lebanon from which they had come. A history of bitter and lethal intergroup violence in Lebanon and Syria, taking thousands of lives at a time, was part of the legacy that Lebanese took to other countries in which they settled. Even in a small country like Sierra Leone, the many internal disputes among various Lebanese factions, which spilled over into the courts and involved political authorities, proved too baffling for either Europeans or Africans to understand, much less settle, during the colonial era. Indeed, one of the main tasks of diplomatic representatives from Lebanon and Sierra Leone after independence was to arbitrate these internal disputes among various Lebanese factions there. Conflicts among various Lebanese Shiite groups spread as far as Australia, and conflict among Lebanese political groups led to the assassination of a refugee from Lebanon living in Brazil. The various Indian middleman minorities, such as the Gujaratis and the Chettiars, have had separate social and economic institutions, both in India and in the many countries where they have settled overseas. As a study of Indian emigration pointed out, most Indians emigrate primarily as members of their subgroup, as Gujaratis, Jains, Sikhs, or Muslims, and most still have arranged marriages within their subgroup. Another study of Indians in East Africa notes that they have been fragmented into so many linguistic, religious, caste, and other subgroups as to constitute a community almost exclusively in the minds of outsiders. The Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire was likewise beset by factionalism. The difference is not between atomistic independence and group-wide ties. Subgroup ties and loyalties within middleman minorities have often been intense, but have seldom encompassed all the people lumped together by others. Education. As communities determine to maintain their own values and work ethic without allowing their children to be influenced by the very different values they often found in the societies around them, middleman minorities have often had their own social institutions, including their own private schools, after they reached an economic level where they could afford them. Even when their children went to public schools, as among Jews in the United States, there were often supplementary schools, such as the Hebrew schools. In other countries, there were often full-time private schools for the children of middlemen minorities, teaching in the Chinese language, the Gujarati language, or whatever the particular language of the particular middleman minority might be. Education has for centuries been a high priority among Jews, even in times and places where illiteracy was the norm among the people around them. A Russian official reported on the Jews in Russian-conquered Poland in 1818. Almost every one The Lebanese have long been among the more highly educated peoples of the Middle East, though in earlier times this did not mean universal literacy, as witnessed by the many illiterate Lebanese immigrants in the 19th and early 20th century. Moreover, it was Christians in Lebanon who were especially likely to become educated. Partly, this was because of Christian missionaries who established schools there for Lebanese Christians. Many of these educated Lebanese immigrated to other countries to live and work, and others went overseas to seek higher education. Before 1970, 40% of all Lebanese entering the United States did so as students. Lebanese students in Brazil tended to specialize in courses that prepared them for careers in business and industry, and later, law. Yet, even those students who went into law tended at first to become attorneys for their family businesses. Political activity. Various ethnic groups in countries around the world have differed greatly in the degree to which they participated in political activity, and in the kind of political activity that they engaged in when they did. The Irish, for example, have heavily engaged in politics and have been highly successful at it. Irish political machines long dominated many American cities, even when Irish voters were a minority within those cities. And people of Irish ancestry have become presidents of the United States and prime ministers in Britain, Canada, and Australia. Middleman minorities have typically not been as involved in politics, nor as successful, and the kinds of politics they have pursued are usually different from the pragmatic, bring-home-the-bacon kinds of politics characteristic of the great Irish political machines. For much of the history of Europe and the Islamic world, there was no place in positions of political authority for Jews, Armenians, or Lebanese, just as there was no place for the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, or for Indians in Fiji, or East Africa, or South Africa. Their whole orientation was usually in other directions, so that even the emergence of democratic societies did not attract as much participation among these groups as among some other ethnic groups. Even the belated emergence of individual politicians from middleman minority groups did not usually mean the development of ethnic group politics. Rather, these political leaders usually rose to prominence as representatives of the larger society. New York's Senator Jacob Javits and Governor Herbert Lehman were general politicians who were Jewish but not ethnic group leaders. In Australia, where the Jews have never been as much as 1% of the population, Jewish politicians have been mayors of Melbourne, Adelaide, and other communities, as well as serving in legislative and judicial posts, obviously not as a result of the Jewish vote, much less as standard bearers of ethnic group politics. The overseas Chinese minorities in Southeast Asia or in the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, the lack of knowledge of either the business or the social imperatives of middlemen by outsiders leaves the majority population vulnerable to exploitation of their ignorance by politicians and activists who can spin plausible-sounding accusations against middleman minorities. These accusations can exploit racial, religious, or other differences, but this is not to say that such differences are the fundamental reasons for the hostility. None of this need suggest that middleman minorities have done nothing to irritate the surrounding population or even to provoke their hostility. The many internal divisions within particular middleman minorities suggests that there are behaviors and attitudes that provoke negative reactions from other subgroups of Jews, overseas Chinese, Lebanese, and others. Against that background, it would hardly be surprising if members of the larger society were also irritated, repelled, or made hostile by the behavior patterns or attitudes among middleman minorities. Moreover, there is independent evidence of illegal and other repellent behavior by members of middleman minorities who have been no more free of sins than any other segment of the human race. Illegal and often violent gang activities by overseas Chinese Tongs in Southeast Asia go back for centuries, and such activities have likewise followed Chinese immigrants to the Western Hemisphere. Jewish pimps made early 20th century Buenos Aires one of the world's centers of prostitution, recruiting women as far away as Eastern Europe. In the United States, there were many prominent Jewish gangsters during the immigrant era, including an organized group of killers for hire called Murder Incorporated. More widespread, if less violent activities included corruption of public officials by the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia and by Jews in Eastern Europe, both being places where such corruption was widespread in the general population and often especially necessary for middlemen minorities in order to escape discriminatory laws. Yet such habits did not end when middleman minorities settled elsewhere. A Yiddish language newspaper in the United States complained of the corrupt behavior of Jews from Russia who got themselves in trouble offering bribes to American officials. In earlier centuries, middleman minorities and other merchants around the world included slaves among the merchandise they traded. These slave traders included Venetians, Greeks, and Jews in Europe, the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, and the Arabs who both captured and sold slaves in Africa. Gujaratis from India often financed the African slave trade, though they did not usually conduct it. In medieval Europe, Jews were major slave traders, often selling Slavs who had been enslaved by German conquerors. Jews were also the principal suppliers of white eunuchs as slaves to the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century. Later, as Italian merchants began displacing Jewish merchants, but most Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were not. Among the occupations declared by Middle Eastern arrivals in Argentina from 1876 to 1900, the overwhelming majority were merchants, and more than a quarter were specifically peddlers as late as 1910. However, it is known that more Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were peasants than were entrepreneurs or moneylenders. But it was in the latter roles that they were more likely to come to the attention of members of the larger society, either through personal contact in the marketplace or through general notoriety. To a greater or lesser degree, that has been true of other middleman minorities. Moreover, the general attitudes of the surrounding society that were formed during the era when these various groups were prominent as middleman minorities have long outlasted that era and continued on as a majority and later generations of middleman minorities have gone into other businesses and professions. Moreover, the striking success of these later generations in education and in other occupations continues to fuel envy and resentment. The role of middleman minorities in various countries around the world has attracted the attention of many scholars and produced many suggested explanations of their roles and experiences. One of the most often cited studies has been A Theory of Middleman Minorities by Edna Bonicic. A crucial element in her theory is that of sojourning. Middlemen minorities have often been sojourners rather than permanent settlers in the societies in which they live. Because they begin as sojourners, according to Professor Bonicic, they have less reason to assimilate to the society around them. While sojourning is not a sufficient condition of the middleman, Professor Bonicic says, it is a necessary one. However, if the economic function performed by middlemen requires social separation from the surrounding society and its culture, then whether they plan to return somewhere else or not is no longer crucial. The sojourning theory encounters serious problems that the economic explanation does not. One of the most prominent of middleman minorities has been American Jews who, as Professor Bonicic concedes, had no plan to return to Eastern Europe. American Jews, in fact, had far lower rates of return migration than did other contemporary immigrants to the United States, or Mexican immigrants in a later era. Even less could Jews who settled in Australia or South America be likely to have had plans to return to their countries of origin. Edna Bonicic attempts to salvage her sojourner thesis by saying that although American Jews did not see Eastern Europe as a place to which they would return, they retained an unusual attachment to an ancestral homeland in the Middle East. Yet Zionism was by no means common among Jews around the world during the period of mass migration to the United States, and in fact, there was hostility to the idea among Orthodox Jews, as well as among Western European Jews in general. Moreover, the real history of slavery. Slavery was an evil of greater scope and magnitude than most people imagine, and, as a result, its place in history is radically different from the way it is usually portrayed. Mention slavery, And immediately the image that arises is that of Africans and their descendants enslaved by Europeans and their descendants in the southern United States, or at most, Africans enslaved by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. No other historic horror is so narrowly construed. No one thinks of war, famine, or decimating epidemics in such localized terms. These are afflictions that have been suffered by the entire human race all over the planet, and so was slavery. Had slavery been limited to one race in one country during 3 centuries, its tragedies would not have been 1/10 the magnitude that they were in fact. Why this provincial view of a worldwide evil? Often, it is those who are most critical of a Eurocentric view of the world who are most Eurocentric when it comes to the evils and failings of the human race. Why would anyone wish to arbitrarily understate an evil that plagued mankind for thousands of years, unless it was not this evil itself that was the real concern, but rather the present-day uses of that historic evil? Clearly, the ability to score ideological points against American society or Western civilization, or to induce guilt and thereby extract benefits from the white population today, are greatly enhanced by making enslavement appear to be a peculiarly American or a peculiarly white crime. This explanation is also consistent with the otherwise inexplicable contrast between the fiery rhetoric about past slavery in the United States, used by those who pass over in utter silence the traumas of slavery that still exist in Mauritania, the Sudan, and parts of Nigeria and Benin. Why so much more concern for dead people who are now beyond our help than for living human beings suffering the burdens and humiliations of slavery today? Why does a verbal picture of the abuses of slaves in centuries past arouse far more response than contemporary photographs of present-day slaves in Time magazine, the New York Times, or the National Geographic? It takes no more research than a trip to almost any public library or college library to show the incredibly lopsided coverage of slavery in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere as compared to the meager writings on the even larger number of Africans enslaved in the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa, not to mention the vast numbers of Europeans also enslaved in centuries past in the Islamic world and within Europe itself. At least 1 million Europeans were enslaved by North African pirates alone from 1500 to 1800, and some European slaves were still being put differently. The areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved. Far from being targeted by Europeans for racial reasons, as some have claimed, Africa was resorted to as a source of large supplies of slaves only after centuries of Europeans enslaving other Europeans had been brought to an end by the consolidation of nations and empires on the European continent, by internal shifts from slavery to serfdom in much of Europe, and by the Catholic Church's pressures against enslaving fellow Christians, which was by no means the same as the Church's saying that slavery, as such, was wrong. Similar consolidations of political units in parts of Asia led to a decline of slavery in those realms. While Africa became the main source of new slaves in later centuries, existing slaves continued to include peoples of many races living in many places around the world. Ending the slavery of all these peoples was a very difficult process, and one requiring deliberate and sustained action for many generations. Ironically, the anti-slavery ideology behind this process began to develop in 18th century Britain, at a time when the British Empire led the world in slave trading, and when the economy of most of its overseas colonies in the Western Hemisphere depended on slaves. Here again, the baffling present-day disregard of an international saga of strife, full of individual dramas as well as historic consequences, seems explicable only in terms of today's ideological agendas. While slavery was common to all civilizations, as well as to peoples considered uncivilized, only one civilization developed a moral revulsion against it very late in its history, Western civilization. Today, it seems so obvious that, as Abraham Lincoln said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. But the hard fact is that for thousands of years, slavery was simply not an issue, even among the great religious thinkers or moral philosophers of civilizations around the world. We may wonder why it took 18 centuries after the Sermon on the Mount for Christians to develop an anti-slavery movement. But a more profound question is why not even the leading moralists in other civilizations rejected slavery at all. There is no evidence, according to a scholarly study, that slavery came under the novelist Machado de Assis recalled that the celebrations following the passage of the Golden Law were the only instance of popular delirium that I can remember ever having seen. One Sao Paulo newspaper described the crowds that gathered to celebrate. To try to describe the splendor of that festival of joy, to tell everything that happened, falls beyond our abilities. Never has this capital seen such multitudinous and unanimous enthusiasm. Perhaps at no other period of history was the contrast between the Western and the non-Western world greater. Here was the scene when the Ottoman Empire announced the end of the slave trade. In 1855, when the Sultan's firman was read out in Mecca and Jeddah, it caused a revolution. Turkish officials, including the Qadi who read the firman, were murdered, the garrison shut, and Mecca was in a state of revolt until the Porte repealed the obnoxious order. And when the Governor General of the Hejaz issued orders on 25th February 1860 forbidding the slave trade in all Turkish ports in the Red Sea, there was great excitement and fear of the recurrence of the 1855 violence. There was no Ottoman cruiser in the Red Sea capable of giving effect to this order, and Turkish officials were too frightened to enforce it. Although the slave trade was formally abolished in the Ottoman Empire, under pressure from the British government, slavery itself continued. As of 1891, the imperial palace purchased 11 slave girls for its harem, as others in the Ottoman Empire purchased women as concubines, typically white women from a region near the Caucasus and the Black Sea, known as Circassia, even though every nation in the Western world had by then outlawed slavery. Not only the Turks accepted such slavery, so did the Circassians. Mothers often groomed their daughters for this role and sold them into what was considered to be a desirable situation, at least by comparison with what was available in Circassia. British Foreign Secretary Palmerston said, "The only complaint we have ever heard from the Circassians has been against our attempts to stop the traffic." Contrary to the myths to live by, created by Alex Haley and others, Africans were by no means the innocents portrayed in Roots, baffled as to why white men were coming in and taking their people away in chains. On the contrary, the region of West Africa from which Kunta Kinte supposedly came was one of the great slave trading regions of the continent, before, during, and after the white man arrived. It was Africans who enslaved their fellow Africans, selling some of these slaves to Europeans or to Arabs and keeping others for themselves. Even at the peak of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans retained more slaves for themselves than they sent to the Western Hemisphere. Naval personnel, racked by fever, sunstroke, and dysentery, were forced to retire prematurely and live on a small pittance. The cost of upkeep of the squadron over the 20 years prior to 1890 was estimated at 4 million sterling, and this did not take into account the large amount of work imposed on consular and judicial staff at Zanzibar in trying cases and dealing with reports, etc. Even so, the results were slow in coming. More streamlined slave ships were designed in hopes of being able to outrun the ships of the Royal Navy in the Atlantic. Nevertheless, the dogged persistence of the British eventually reduced the shipment of slaves across the Atlantic and across the waters of the Islamic world. Although the French flag was for many years widely used as protection from the boarding of ships on the high seas by the British Navy, even by slave traders who were neither French nor authorized to fly the French flag, eventually France itself turned against slavery, outlawed the institution, and sent some of its own warships to patrol the Atlantic off the coast of Africa to intercept and deter the shipment of slaves to the Western Hemisphere. The American flag was likewise so used, and the United States, like France, eventually turned against the slave trade and sent warships to join the Atlantic patrols to interdict slave shipments. Although by 1860, the Atlantic slave trade had been effectively stopped, the slave trade from East Africa across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf took longer to be reduced significantly. Off the east coast of Africa, smaller Arab vessels called dhows hugged the coastlines in waters too shallow for the British warships to enter. One British commodore estimated that he captured one dhow for every 8 that escaped. Nevertheless, during the period from 1866 to 1869, 129 slave vessels were captured and 3,380 slaves were freed. When the threat of being boarded seemed imminent, the Arabs would throw slaves overboard to drown, rather than have them be found on board, which could lead to British seizure of the vessel and punishment of those who manned it. The worst that could befall the slaves was when the slaver was overhauled by a British cruiser, and they might then be flung overboard to dispose of all evidence. Devereux mentions a case where the Arabs, when pursued by an English cruiser, cut the throats of 24 slaves and threw them overboard. Colomb also states that Arabs would not hesitate to knock slaves on the head and throw them overboard to avoid capture. Because there were only a few naval ships available to cover a vast expanse of water in this region, British warships would often launch smaller boats to engage the Arab slave dhows. In these cases, as one study put it, the slave traffickers frequently did not hesitate. Only in the American South did a large apologetic literature develop, seeking to justify slavery, because only there was slavery under such large-scale and sustained attacks on moral grounds as to require a response. While slavery was referred to in antebellum America as a peculiar institution, in an international perspective and in the long view of history, it was not this institution that was peculiar, but the principles of American freedom, with which slavery was in such obvious and irreconcilable conflict. If all men were created equal, as the Declaration of Independence proclaimed, then the only way to justify slavery was by depicting those enslaved as not fully men. A particularly virulent form of racism thus arose from a particularly desperate need to defend slavery against telling attacks that invoked the fundamental principles of the American Republic. Nowhere else in the world was slavery in such dire straits ideologically, and nowhere else did racism reach such heights, or depths, in defense of the institution. As a noted study of Brazil observed, the defenders of slavery on clearly racist grounds were as rare among public supporters of slavery in Brazil as they were common in the United States. Brazil was not a democracy, and so had no such ideological contradictions to overcome. In short, racism was neither necessary nor sufficient for slavery, whose origins antedated racism by centuries. Racism was a result, not a cause, of slavery, and not all societies that enslaved people of another race became pervaded with racism to the extent that the American South did. The stark contrast between the slave and the free, which made slavery a moral issue in the Western world in modern times, was simply not there for most societies, and for most of history in most of the world. In hierarchical societies, where people were born into their stations in life, ranging through many gradations from royalty to bondage, slavery was simply the bottom rung on a ladder based on the accident of birth, one notch below the serf, who was bought and sold with the land, instead of individually. This is not to say that being a slave was a matter of indifference. A horror of becoming a slave has been widespread around the world, but this is wholly different from a reluctance to enslave others. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all forbade the enslavement of their own respective fellow religionists, though they did not always honor even this ban, but all considered it permissible to enslave others. Clergy themselves had slaves, and both Christian monasteries in Europe and Buddhist monasteries in Asia owned slaves. Even Sir Thomas More's fictional ideal society, Utopia, had slavery. It was not until the late 18th century that there was even then not against a powerful nation like France, but only extraordinary political pressures at home made it necessary. Moreover, this was a moral crusade continually fanned by reports from British missionaries in Africa and elsewhere. as well as by anti-slavery sentiments from other sources. Queen Victoria told Harriet Beecher Stowe that she had wept when she read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yet one of the signs of our own times is that intellectuals have made desperate but futile efforts to depict the worldwide British anti-slavery crusade as somehow motivated by economic self-interest, rather than by the kinds of moral imperatives activating the kinds of people that today's intellectuals find hard to understand. At the time, however, John Stuart Mill said that the British, for the last half-century, have spent annual sums equal to the revenue of a small kingdom in blockading the Africa coast, for a cause in which we not only had no interest, but which was contrary to our own pecuniary interest. While Britain spearheaded the anti-slavery movement in the world, the 19th century saw anti-slavery feelings spread until they became common throughout Western civilization, and only in Western civilization. By 1888, every country in the Western Hemisphere had abolished slavery, as had all European and European offshoot nations around the world. Yet attempts to abolish slavery in the non-Western world provoked armed uprisings within the Ottoman Empire. And elsewhere, peoples unable to directly mount challenges on the battlefield nevertheless engaged in massive evasions and concealments of their continued trade in human beings. After the open slave market in Istanbul was shut down, slaves continued to be smuggled in, often at night and in small groups, from the Caucasus and from around the Black Sea, among other places. Suppressing the slave trade across the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea was much harder and took much longer than suppressing the Atlantic slave trade. While slaves were transported across the Atlantic in large ships packed with their human cargoes, slaves were carried in smaller and more numerous vessels, along with rice, fish, and other merchandise, from East Africa to the Islamic world. British naval patrols were overwhelmed by the task of sorting out which of the innumerable Arab vessels were carrying slaves at a given time and place, and these patrols were never able to intercept more than a fraction of the slaves being shipped out of East Africa to the Islamic world of the Middle East and North Africa. Moreover, such success as the British had on the high seas led to a shifting of more of the slave trade to land, and especially to inland areas away from the ports and coastal outposts where British naval power could be exerted. With the passage of time, however, especially as other European powers began to adopt anti-slavery policies, not only for themselves, and some African and Asian slave owners used their slaves as human sacrifices in religious ceremonies, as did the Mayans in the Western Hemisphere. Europeans enslaved by North Africans were often used as galley slaves, which could be killing work. But slaves or former slaves in non-Western countries did not have an audience for stories of their oppressions comparable to that of slaves or former slaves in the United States, where the experiences of Frederick Douglass and other former slaves were widely publicized outside the South. The lone exception would be the narratives of European slaves in North Africa after they were ransomed or escaped back to Europe, or the stories told by the smaller number of Americans who were enslaved in North Africa and then rescued by the U.S. Navy in the early 19th century. But the audiences for their stories were in the West, not in the Islamic countries where they had been enslaved. Moreover, the stories of white slaves in the Islamic world were of interest only in the West of their time, not in the West of our time, when such experiences are largely passed over in silence, like other historical facts that do not fit today's visions and agendas. Direct observation of the treatment of slaves was less common with domestic slaves living behind walls or galley slaves hidden in the bowels of ships, as distinguished from plantation slaves working out in open fields. However, what was directly observable in the Islamic world were the slave caravans which marched vast numbers of human beings from their homes where they had been captured to the places where they would be sold, hundreds of miles away, often after spending months crossing the burning sands of the Sahara. The death toll on these marches exceeded even the horrific toll on packed slave ships crossing the Atlantic. Slaves who could not keep up with the caravans were abandoned in the desert and left to die a lingering death from heat, thirst, and hunger. Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone, mostly the skeletons of young women and girls who were more in demand than men in much of the Islamic world. These skeletons tended to cluster in the vicinity of wells, suggesting their last desperate efforts to reach water. A letter from an Ottoman official in 1849 referred to 1,600 black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya. It has been estimated that for every slave to reach Cairo alive, several died on the way. Whether or not the survivors were later treated better or worse than slaves in the Western Hemisphere after reaching their final destinations is by no means the whole story. While much of the history of the treatment of slaves has been presented as a history of the treatment of African slaves, the treatment of European slaves in North Africa and elsewhere was by no means benign. For example, this was the scene in 18th century Algiers as newly captured European slaves were paraded through town. Since the arrival of new slaves was a sign of prosperity and an occasion of civic pride for all the townsfolk, the resident Turks, Moors, Jews, and renegades all turned out to cheat. Few who actually lived in antebellum America thought that slavery could be ended in the South by simple fiat, even though it was abolished that way without incident in most northern states. The situation was radically different in the two parts of the country. Slaves were only a relatively minor part of the northern population, and plantation slavery was virtually unknown, partly because the climate and soil did not lend themselves to the kinds of crops that could be grown efficiently on cotton plantations in the South or on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Therefore, in the North, the question of abolishing slavery as an institution did not raise serious questions about what to do with the people who had been enslaved. Some affluent whites in the North lost their black household servants, or rehired them as employees, or sold them to the South, where slavery was still prevalent. But the relatively small numbers of people involved meant that it was not a major problem for the North in any case. Southerners faced a very different situation, with momentous economic and social implications. Blacks were a much higher percentage of the total Southern population than in the Northern states, and in some places were an absolute majority. From the first census of 1790 to the last census before the Civil War in 1860, slaves were approximately 1/3 of the total Southern population. As of 1860, slaves were more than 40% of the population of Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana, and more than half the population of Mississippi and South Carolina, freeing in their midst millions of people of an alien race and unknown disposition, and with no history in either Africa or America that would prepare them to be citizens of a society such as the United States, was not an experiment that many were willing to risk in these states, not when it could mean risking their lives. Only those on opposite ends of a spectrum of opinion found the issue of slavery easy, those like Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who wished to keep blacks enslaved indefinitely, and those like Massachusetts' William Lloyd Garrison, who advocated immediate emancipation of blacks with the full rights of citizenship. Ironically, both men reasoned on the basis of abstract principles, legalistic principles in the case of Calhoun, and moralistic principles in the case of Garrison. In both cases, the relentless march of their syllogisms left the painful human realities and dilemmas fading into the dim background. For the majority of Americans in between, neither option was acceptable, nor was any other option able to command a general consensus. The kind of strange cross-currents this situation generated were perhaps epitomized by the career of Congressman John Randolph of Virginia, a prominent and bitter opponent of the abolitionists, who nevertheless hated slavery. Slavery was to him a cancer, but one which must not be tampered with by quacks, including both the continuation of slavery and the ending of it in the manner in which it was in fact ended by the Civil War, at a cost of 1 life for every 6 slaves freed. Many problems can be made simple, but only by leaving out the complications which those in the midst of these problems cannot so easily escape with a turn of a phrase, as those who look back on them in later centuries can. Even at the individual level, it was not always legally possible for a slave owner to simply set a slave free, for authorities had to approve in many states. When a motion was introduced into the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1769 to allow slave owners to free their slaves unilaterally, a motion seconded by Thomas Jefferson, there was anger at such a suggestion, and the motion was roundly defeated. An unlimited power to release slaves into the larger society was considered too dangerous to leave in private hands. Many who have dismissed the anti-slavery words of the founders of the American Republic as just rhetoric have not bothered to check the facts of history. Washington, Jefferson, and other founders did not just talk, they acted. Even when they acted within the political and legal constraints of their times, they acted repeatedly, sometimes winning and sometimes losing. One of the early battles that was lost was Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, which criticized King George III for having enslaved Africans and for overriding colonial Virginia's attempt to ban slavery. The Continental Congress removed that phrase under pressure from representatives from the South. When Jefferson drafted a state constitution for Virginia in 1776, his draft included a clause prohibiting any more importation of slaves, and in 1783, Jefferson included in a new draft of a Virginia Constitution a proposal for gradual emancipation of slaves. He was defeated in both these efforts. On the national scene, Jefferson returned to the battle once again in 1784, proposing a law declaring slavery illegal in all western territories of the country as it existed at that time. Such a ban would have kept slavery out of Alabama and Mississippi. The bill lost by one vote, that of a legislator too sick to come and vote. Afterwards, Jefferson said that the fate of millions unborn was hanging on the tongue of one man, and heaven was silent in that awful moment. 3 years later, however, Congress compromised by passing the Northwest Ordinance, making slavery illegal in the upper Western territories, while allowing it in the lower Western territories. Congress was later authorized to ban the African slave trade, and Jefferson, now president, urged that they use that authority to stop Americans from all further participation in those violations of human rights which has been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa. Congress followed his urging. He saw the heavy moral stigma of slavery, but also the social dangers to flesh and blood people. He wrote in a letter, "I can say with conscious truth that there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach in any practicable way. The cession of that kind of property, for so it is misnamed, is a bagatelle, which would not cost me a second thought if in that way a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected. And gradually and with due sacrifices, I think it might be. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other." Many other slave owners, of course, saw their slaves as simply a source of wealth, and were therefore determined to hold on to them for that reason. However, even those slaveholders with aversions to slavery in principle were constrained by a strong tradition of stewardship, in which the family inheritance was not theirs to dispose of in their own lifetime, but to pass on to others as it had been passed on to them. George Washington was one of those who had inherited slaves and, dying childless, freed his slaves in his will, effective on the death of his wife. His will also provided that slaves too old or too beset with bodily infirmities to take care of themselves should be taken care of by his estate, and that the children were to be taught to read and write and trained for some useful occupation. His estate, in fact, continued to pay for the support of some freed slaves for decades after his death, in accordance with his will. The part of Washington's will dealing with slaves filled almost 3 pages, and the tone, as well as the length of it, showed his concerns. The Emancipation Clause stands out from the rest of Washington's will in the unique forcefulness of its language. Elsewhere in it, Washington used the standard legal expressions, "I give and bequeath," "It is my will and direction." In one instance, he politely wrote, "By way of advice, I recommend to my executors." But the Emancipation Clause rings with the voice of command. It has the iron firmness of a field order. "I do hereby expressly forbid the sale of any slave I may die possessed of, under any pretext whatsoever." Long before reaching this point in his personal life, George Washington had said of slavery as a national issue, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it." But like Burke, he saw a need for a plan of some sort, rather than simply freeing millions of slaves in a newly emerging nation surrounded by threatening powers, just as the freed slaves themselves would be surrounded by a hostile population. In short, the moral principle was easy, but figuring out how to apply it in practice was not. Moreover, one of the few individuals whose appeal to President Abraham Lincoln for clemency was denied was a ship's captain named Nathaniel Gordon, who was hanged in 1862 after having been caught bringing slaves out of Africa. His ship was bound for Cuba, but was intercepted on the high seas by a warship of the American Navy because of the international ban on slave trading, even though slavery itself was still perfectly legal at the time in Africa, in Cuba, and in the United States. Clearly, the evil nature of slavery was recognized by the severe penalties imposed in America on those who continued to bring slaves from Africa, though there was not yet a consensus on what to do about the millions of enslaved people already in the country. In the North, with all the hesitation in many matters, there existed unanimity in regard to the slave trade, according to W.E.B. Du Bois. Gordon's trial and execution were not even controversial and received little attention in the press. Even in the antebellum South, Virginia Congressman John Randolph again exemplified the cross-currents of the times in the dichotomy between the way that slave trading was seen and the way that slavery itself was seen. Although a fierce opponent of the abolitionists, Congressman Randolph was nevertheless adamant against slave trading, at home or abroad. Despite being a slave owner, Randolph did not engage in the practice of buying or selling slaves himself, and denounced on the floor of the House of Representatives those hard-hearted masters who broke up Black families by selling their members. Randolph urged the federal government to act in an area where it had legal jurisdiction, to ban domestic slave trading in the District of Columbia. The fact that there was no such general support for making domestic slave trading a criminal offense as for making the international slave trade a capital offense reflected the fact that the former did not increase the total number of slaves in the United States, nor take any more people out of Africa. However, being a domestic slave trader was not without social stigma, even in the antebellum South. This moral distinction between slave trading and the continuation of slavery as an institution might be hard for some in later centuries to understand, because in the abstract, there is no moral difference. Only in the concrete circumstances faced by the people of the times was there a practical social difference. The Civil War that grew out of tensions over slavery was the bloodiest war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere and cost more American lives than any other war in the country's history. Whether or not those fighting on either side thought of their battles as being over slavery, as distinguished from secession, without slavery, there would have been no secession and no Civil War. The states that first seceded were states where slaves were the highest percentage of the population. Contemporary words and deeds by the leaders of the Confederacy made for the United States, a case could be made that this was due to the Civil War, which did so much damage to the South. But no such explanation would apply to Brazil, which fought no civil war over this issue. Moreover, even in the United States, the South lagged behind the North in many ways, even before the Civil War. Although slavery in Europe died out before it was abolished in the Western Hemisphere, as late as 1776, slavery had not yet died out all across the continent when Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations that it still existed in some eastern regions. But even then, Eastern Europe was much poorer than Western Europe. The slavery of North Africa and the Middle East over the centuries took more slaves from sub-Saharan Africa than the Western Hemisphere did, in addition to large imports of slaves from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe to the Muslim countries of North Africa and the Middle East. But these remained largely poor countries until the discovery and extraction of their vast oil deposits. In many parts of the non-Western world, slaves were sources of domestic amenities and means of displaying wealth with an impressive retinue, rather than sources of wealth. Often, they were a drain on the wealth already possessed. According to a scholarly study of slavery in China, the slaves there did not generate any surplus, they consumed it. Another study concluded, the Middle East and the Arab world rarely used slaves for productive activities, even though some slave owners, those whose slaves produced commercial crops or other saleable products, received wealth from the fruits of the unpaid labor of these slaves. That is very different from saying that the society as a whole, or even its non-slave population as a whole, ended up wealthier than it would have been in the absence of slavery. Not only in societies where slaves were more often consumers than producers of wealth, but even in societies where commercial slavery was predominant, this did not automatically translate into enduring wealth. Unlike a frugal capitalist class, such as created the Industrial Revolution, even commercial slave owners in the American antebellum South tended to spend lavishly, often ending up in debt or even losing their plantations to foreclosures by creditors. However, even if British slave owners had saved and invested all of their profits from slavery, it would have amounted to less than 2% of British domestic investment. In the United States, it is doubtful whether the profits of slavery would have covered the enormous costs of the Civil War, a war that was fought over the immediate issue of secession. But the reason for the secession was to safeguard slavery from the growing anti-slavery sentiment outside the South, symbolized by the election of Abraham Lincoln. Brazil, which had several times as many slaves as the United States, and perhaps consumed more slaves than any other nation in history, was nevertheless still a relatively undeveloped country when slavery ended. However one resolves the question of the black-white differences in rates of married and unwed motherhood, the more fundamental question as regards the legacy of slavery argument is why black marriage rates began a precipitous decline in 1960, nearly a century after the end of slavery. While the percentage of first births that were premarital has long differed as between blacks and whites, as it differed between antebellum white Southerners and white Northerners, and between other groups around the world in places where slavery cannot be invoked as an explanation, the sharp increase in premarital first births among blacks began in the 1960s. From 1930 to 1934, 31% of first births to black women were premarital, while from 1990 to 1994, 77% were. Moreover, whereas in 1930 to 1934, premarital births plus the births of children conceived before marriage but born after marriage were together still a minority in all black births. By 1994, these two categories constituted 86% of all black births. That such a legacy of slavery would take nearly a century to appear strains credulity. Summary and implications. The history of slavery can be looked at from several perspectives or for several purposes. Whether slavery is examined morally, causally, or politically is a matter of individual choice. But once that choice is made, accuracy and consistency are crucial. Moral judgments must be made with the facts as they are or were and applied consistently, regardless of the race, nationality, or religion of either the enslavers or the enslaved. These facts include the social context and the constraints and consequences implied by that context. We cannot assume 21st century options or even present-day knowledge when judging decisions made in the 19th century. Nor can we assume that we have superior knowledge of the social realities of an earlier era that we never lived through, compared to the first-hand knowledge of those who confronted those realities daily and inescapably. Moral questions about slavery have been almost exclusively Western moral questions. Non-Western societies had neither moral concerns about slavery nor, in most cases, the power to decide on the continuance or extinction of the institution for themselves during the era of European imperialism, when slavery was suppressed over most of the world by the West. Not only has the West's crucial role in the destruction of slavery around the world gone largely unnoticed, standards applied almost exclusively to the West have been used to condemn European and European offshoot societies for having once had slavery. Even those Western leaders who sought to end scholars have long known that slavery was a worldwide institution going back thousands of years, though that has not led them to provide comparable coverage to slavery outside Western civilization. One scholar whose study of slavery encompassed Islamic as well as Western countries observed, slavery has been a common feature of human history, appearing in nearly every part of the world. Though his own study did not extend across the vast reaches of Asia or to the Polynesian islands. Another scholar, distinguished for his studies of the Atlantic slave trade, declared, "Slavery until recently was universal in two senses. Most settled societies incorporated the institution into their social structures, and few peoples in the world have not constituted a major source of slaves at one time or another." Despite such common knowledge among scholars, the version of the history of slavery more commonly depicted to the general public, as well as to students in our schools and colleges, is more along the lines of Roots or other similar productions. On the other end of the spectrum, one of the rationales for slavery used in both ancient times and in more recent centuries has been that consigning some people to perform the drudgery of the world freed others to pursue the higher things: education, invention, political leadership, the arts, etc., and thus advanced civilization as a whole. Plato and Socrates came out of a slaveholding society, as did many of the remarkable leaders who founded the American Republic. But correlation is not causation, and even the correlation is not as clear as some apologists for slavery have assumed. Although Brazil imported several times as many slaves as the United States, it would be difficult to find Brazilian equivalents of Plato or Socrates or other world leaders in the advancement of civilization in the arts or sciences. The remarkable number of early American leaders who came out of Virginia, including Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, had no counterparts in other southern states, which collectively had vastly larger numbers of slaves than those of Virginia. The South as a whole lagged far behind the North in producing leaders in the arts and sciences. Slavery has been too facile an explanation of both the positive and negative aspects of slaveholding societies. The idea that slavery was based on race or racism is yet another popular notion that will not stand up to a scrutiny of history, as we have already seen. Yet, beliefs about the innate ability of Blacks in the United States by prominent American leaders of an earlier era have been invested with great moral implications by those seeking to score points. But beliefs are neither moral nor immoral. They may be accurate or inaccurate, founded or unfounded, but they acquire moral significance only when they are shaped to serve some ulterior purpose that is either moral or immoral. Germans and history. Germans are an old people. Their language is centuries older than English, French, Spanish, or Italian. But the history of a dozen years has cast a long shadow over the thousands of years of their existence as a people. The rule of Hitler and the Nazis from 1933 to 1945 not only sealed the fate of the Germans of that generation, it has colored the way Germans have been seen since then, as well as the way the previous history of Germans has been seen. German intellectual figures, social traditions, and political movements in centuries past that were once seen in the context of their own times are now often seen as precursors of Nazi totalitarianism or of the Holocaust. Was all of German history leading up to Hitler? Or were the Nazi years simply a tragic aberration on a monumental scale? The collectivization of Germans in the minds of others has had major consequences in the real world, quite aside from its impact on intellectual conceptions of this people. At the end of the Second World War, millions of people of German ancestry living outside the Reich in various parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans were sent back to Germany, even though many of these families had been living where they were for centuries, and many of the individuals sent back to Germany had in fact never seen Germany. Winston Churchill protested these mass expulsions of millions of Germans on a scale grievous and undreamed of, and said, "We must banish revenge against an entire race from our minds." In order to assess the 12 fateful years of the Nazi regime and its relationship to German culture and history in general, we must first review that history and that culture. Germans, as a people, have extended well beyond the boundaries of present-day Germany, not only in Europe, but in overseas settlements in the Western Hemisphere and as far away as Australia. The extent to which these far-flung settlements could be considered German, and for how long, depends of course on the extent to which German culture persisted among them, and whether or not that culture was linked to the German nation-state. To assess that, we need to see, at least in outline, some of the prominent features of the culture and values historically associated with Germans. Moreover, the features of German culture stand out in sharper relief against the cultures of the surrounding peoples, such as the Slavs of Eastern Europe or the British and French to the west. Germans before Germany. Germans were recognized as a distinct people as far back as Roman times, many centuries before there was a nation-state of Germany. Like other peoples, Germans evolved socially, culturally, and politically within the influence and constraints of geography and the imperatives of other peoples. One reason for the German cultural predominance was simply that they were literate much more often than the indigenous populations of Eastern and Central Europe. Most Russians, for example, were illiterate in the late 19th century, but 94% of the Germans in Riga could read and write. In the Austrian Empire, even as late as the beginning of the 20th century, the illiteracy rate of Polish adults was 40%, and among Serbo-Croatians was 77%. But among Germans, only 6%. Education, however, was just one symptom of a vast difference in skills between the indigenous populations of Eastern Europe living overwhelmingly in the countrysides and the skills of the outsiders living in urban enclaves among them. Merchants from the indigenous populations in East Central Europe were usually unable to compete successfully with more experienced merchants who came from Western Europe and other places with a long history of commerce. Even in agriculture, places with rich soil such as Romania and Russia had lower crop yields than those in Western Europe, where agricultural practices were more advanced. The difference was in the people rather than the soil. German farming communities in Eastern Europe likewise had higher crop yields than those of the surrounding populations. During the Middle Ages, the mining skills for which Germans became widely known led to the establishment of predominantly German mining communities in the Balkans. German priests converted the Czechs to Christianity, and the University of Prague, the first university in Eastern Europe, was founded in 1348 with a predominantly German faculty. Dorpat University in Riga, established by the Tsar in 1802, was likewise in effect a German university on Russian soil, with nearly half its faculty coming from Germany itself. Although Germans were only about 1% of the population of the Russian Empire, they lived clustered in enclaves, both urban and rural, that remained culturally German for centuries. In the 1880s, more than half the Russian Foreign Ministry was German, as were nearly all members of the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences. Polish authorities imposed German agricultural practices on Polish peasants. German words crept into the languages of Eastern Europe, and Slavic rulers in medieval Mecklenburg gave their children German names. In Russia, there were such phrases as punctual as a German, and as honest as a German. The transfer of skills and cultures into Eastern Europe was by no means always socially harmonious, however. Those who had cultural advantages resisted having their cultures diluted by the culture of the indigenous people around them, and the indigenous people resented those advantages and the foreigners who had them. During the Middle Ages, Slavs were barred from membership in some German guilds in Eastern Europe, and members of those guilds who married Slavs. German craftsmanship in metal created the first armor and swords manufactured in Mexico, as well as the renowned Kentucky rifle, which was in fact made by Germans in Pennsylvania. For thousands of years, Germans excelled in military operations. German generals held positions of high command in the Roman legions, as they would in later centuries command armies in Tsarist Russia, in South America, and in the United States from the Revolutionary War of 1776 to the two world wars of the 20th century, in both of which the U.S. Army was commanded by generals of German ancestry, Pershing and Eisenhower, respectively. German commanders of American military forces in the Second World War also included Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet, and General Karl Spaatz, whose bombers reduced much of Germany to rubble. In both world wars, the armies of Germany inflicted far more casualties on opposing forces than the Germans sustained themselves. During the Middle Ages, the Teutonic Knights conquered Prussia, which became the heartland of German military prowess for centuries to come. German fighting men were in demand by rulers in Eastern Europe and in the Ottoman Empire, and were used by the British in their attempt to suppress the rebellious American colonies, as well as by the Americans in order to bring their citizen army up to the military standards required to fight the British. Ironically, Germans produced not only leading military men, but also leading pacifist groups, such as the Mennonites, who also spread to other countries. Whether in agriculture, industry, commerce, or the military, Germans became known for thoroughness, organization, punctuality, and hard work, as well as for specific skills. Other countries not only welcomed German immigrants, but some actively recruited them, and in some cases, subsidized their travel. Not only in Eastern Europe, but also in developing nations in the Western Hemisphere and in Australia, Germans were recruited to pioneer in opening up undeveloped wilderness. Cultural persistence. Wherever Germans settled around the world, there were newspapers printed in German. In Russia, the St. Petersburger Zeitung was founded in 1727, followed in later years by the Saratov Deutsche Zeitung in the German agricultural settlements on the Volga, and the Odessa Zeitung among Germans who settled by the Black Sea. In the United States during the immigrant era, most of the foreign language newspapers in the country were German. St. Louis had 2 daily newspapers in German as early as 1845, and out on the plains, there was an Odessa Zeitung set up by German immigrants from Russia who had kept their language and culture intact after settling in Russia for generations and then resettling in the United States. German language newspapers were published daily in 15 American cities. Education. Among the things that Germans had in common, wherever they were from and wherever they settled, was making education a high priority. Even among German farmers pioneering in the wilderness of 19th century Brazil, German schools appeared in the first clearings in the woods, while most native-born Brazilians remained illiterate on into the 20th century. This reflected the high priority of education among Germans in Europe, where the term kindergarten originated and where the German research-oriented and doctorate-granting university became the model for modern American universities. Education was not just for intellectuals or academics, however. German farmers and craftsmen learned to read and write, even in times and places where the surrounding population was illiterate, as in most of Eastern Europe and in Brazil. Education became the foundation for German prominence in the professions and in science and technology, both at home and abroad. In 19th century America, 1/3 of all the physicians in New York State were of German ancestry. As already noted, in Tsarist Russia, Germans predominated in the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences. In Argentina, German academics predominated in the Institute of Physics, Astronomical Laboratory, Natural History Museum, National Bureau of Mines and Geology, and in its Institute of Military Geography. The German nation. With the passing generations, the kinds of Germans who immigrated from their homeland changed, as that homeland itself changed. In the early 19th century, the small German states and principalities which existed prior to their being consolidated into a nation in 1871 were a largely agrarian world in which 3/4 of the population lived in small villages and towns. Its manufactured goods, such as textiles and metal products, were produced largely by artisans and craftsmen, rather than by large-scale industrial enterprises, such as were developing in Britain. While Germans were economically more advanced than the peoples of Eastern Europe, they lagged behind other countries in Western Europe in technology and in sophisticated commercial and financial institutions. But all of that changed during the course of the 19th century. At first, the Germans simply borrowed the more advanced methods of the British in industry and agriculture. Britons installed industrial equipment and built railroads in Germany and taught Germans how to operate both. British capital financed the Industrial Revolution of wool and helped create the German steel industry, with Belgians and the French also contributing technology to German economic development. Yet, once launched into the industrial age, the Germans surpassed their mentors before the end of the 19th century. The number of German steam engines tripled between 1834 and 1850. Hitler counted on no enthusiasm for war on the part of the German people. On the contrary, he preceded his invasion of Poland with elaborate charades of seeking peace. In order to make it appear that the Poles had attacked Germany, he even staged border incidents, using Germans in Polish uniforms to fire weapons and leaving concentration camp inmates dying as casualties of the purported Polish attacks. None of this was expected to fool the outside world. That it was considered necessary to fool the German people, insulated by a government-controlled press, suggests a serious difference between the aims and values of the Nazis and the aims and values of the people whom they were leading and misleading. Differences between the goals and imperatives of the Nazis and those of the millions of Germans living outside the Reich were even clearer. The Volksdeutsche. As of 1935, there were an estimated 95 million Germans living in various countries around the world. 65 million in Germany itself, 6.5 million in Austria, 3.3 million in Czechoslovakia, and 1.2 million in the Soviet Union, as well as sizable numbers of Germans scattered throughout other European countries to the east and south of Germany. Many of these became involved politically with the German nation before and during the Nazi era in a way very different from that of people of German ancestry living in the Western Hemisphere or Australia. In addition to those Germans who had settled in Eastern and Southern Europe in centuries past, Germans living outside Germany, ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, as distinguished from German citizens living at home or abroad, Reichsdeutsch, included Germans who suddenly found themselves minorities in new nations created by the breakup of the Habsburg Empire, and Germans stranded across new national boundary lines created by the Treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War. While the Germans living in Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, were the largest and best known of these, others included Germans living in the South Tyrol that had been transferred from Austria to Italy, and Germans living in the newly reconstituted nation of Poland. These Volksdeutsche faced varying degrees of discrimination from country to country, and from time to time, without discrimination becoming more severe during the Great Depression of the 1930s, when economic opportunities became more scarce for everyone. Years before the Nazis came to power in Germany, these Volksdeutsche in other countries organized themselves for various forms of protest and political activity in self-defense. Not only did the Nazis have little interest initially in these Volksdeutsche organizations and movements, the Volksdeutsche had little interest in Germany's Nazis, and even those Germans abroad who established relationships with organizations within Germany usually did so with non-Nazi organizations. Racial fanaticism. The Nazi amalgamation of nation and race under totalitarian rule, one people, one country, one leader, led to the horror most unforgettably burned into the history of Germany and of Germans: the murder of millions of Jews and others deemed to be of inferior races. Was this the culmination of long-standing beliefs and actions of the German people, or a monstrous new creation of the Nazis? In Germany, as in other countries, there were people hostile to the Jews on religious, racial, or other grounds. Nor were these isolated anti-Jewish individuals. There were institutions, movements, and political parties hostile to Jews, sometimes bitterly and venomously so. And these included historic figures from Martin Luther to Richard Wagner. But the ultimate question is how all this affected the behavior of the German people as a whole, as compared to other peoples in Europe and elsewhere. Self-aggrandizement and bias against others has been too tragically pervasive throughout human history and among peoples around the world to make it a distinctive characteristic of a particular people or a particular era. However, racism in its modern sense of belief in innate genetic inferiority and superiority of particular races has had a shorter history, dating from the last half of the 19th century, when some regarded this doctrine as a logical corollary of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Hostility to Jews, for example, had existed for thousands of years, but anti-Semitism, in the strict sense of believing in the biological inferiority of Jews as a Semitic people, was one of the offshoots of what was regarded as scientific racism. This new racism that wrapped itself in the mantle of science was neither peculiar to Germany nor limited in its application to Jews. In the United States, some referred to the immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe as the beaten men of beaten races, who would be incapable of being able to be absorbed into American society. The eugenics movement sought to limit the reproduction of inferior individuals and races so as to prevent the lowering of the national intelligence in future generations. Planned Parenthood was founded not simply as an organization for limiting the size of families in general, but more particularly to reduce the reproduction of the Black population in the United States, as Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger herself noted. Such ideas were common among intellectuals who considered themselves progressive at the beginning of the 20th century. Ironically, although the logical corollary of this genetic determinism was that national IQs would fall over time, as less successful people with generally lower IQs tended to reproduce at a higher rate than more successful people with higher IQs. Research in the last years of the 20th century, a study that attempted to answer these questions, concluded middle class and other voters did not vote for Hitler because he promised to exterminate European Jewry. Neither did they vote for him because he promised to tear up the Constitution, impose a police state, destroy labor unions, eradicate rival political parties, or cripple the churches. Even Hitler's Mein Kampf did not forecast these events. During the years leading up to the Second World War, Hitler moved against the Jews in orchestrated stages, allowing him to gauge the extent to which German public opinion supported his actions. A Nazi-sponsored boycott of Jewish stores in 1933 failed so badly that it was called off after 4 days, rather than have it be an ongoing fiasco. Even after 5 years of anti-Jewish propaganda in Germany, when the Nazis in November 1938 unleashed Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, featuring violence against Jews, their homes, and their businesses, the negative reactions of Germans, including some Nazi party members, led Hitler to proceed against the Jews thereafter with as much secrecy as possible. Even when Jews were rounded up and sent off to concentration camps, there was nothing at that point to indicate the grisly fate awaiting them, and it was a crime punishable by death to reveal the extermination program. Rumors circulated, and some undoubtedly knew more than rumors, but rumors and speculations always abound in wartime. Moreover, even those who were certain of what was happening had no ability to stop it in a totalitarian state, and they and their families could pay with their lives for publicly protesting. Even a prominent German Jewish leader like Leo Baeck said that he did not know about Auschwitz and the systematic killing of Jews until 1943, even though millions of Jews had already been killed by then. Genocide against the Jews was a government program, not the lethal mob violence unleashed against the Jews in earlier pogroms in Eastern Europe, or against the Armenians in Turkey during the First World War, or against the Igbos in Nigeria in the 1960s, or against the Chinese in a number of Southeast Asian countries on a number of occasions over the centuries. Given the fact that Jews had been stripped of legal protections early in the Nazi regime, any of these things might have been done by the German people. Indeed, Hitler tried to represent Kristallnacht as a spontaneous burst of public outrage, rather than as the staged event that it was. But what the German people did not do in these circumstances may be more revealing about their own attitudes. None of this denies that there were anti-Semitic fanatics in Germany, both in the Nazi Party and among the German public. It simply makes the dimensions and duration of anti-Semitism among Germans at large subject to question. What must also be noted is that Jews were a very small minority. Black education, achievements, myths, and tragedies. Will Rogers once said that it was not ignorance that was so bad, but, as he put it, all the things we know that ain't so. Nowhere is that more true than in American education today, where fashions prevail and evidence is seldom asked for or given. Nowhere does this do more harm than in the education of Black children. The quest for esoteric methods of trying to educate Black children proceeds as if such children had never been successfully educated before, when in fact there are concrete examples, both from history and from our own times, of schools that have been successful in educating Black children, including those from low-income families. Yet the prevailing educational dogma is that you simply cannot expect children who are not middle class to do well on standardized tests, for all sorts of sociological and psychological reasons. This dogma is not even true for the children for whom it is most often invoked, Black American children, much less for minority children in general, whether in the United States or in other countries. Schools, past achievements. Contrary to prevailing educational dogmas, there are schools in America today where low-income Black and other minority students do in fact score well on standardized tests, both public schools and private schools, secular and religious, even as the vast majority of ghetto schools have abysmal performances on such tests. Moreover, there has been successful Black education as far back as the 19th century. High-performance schools. In 1899, there were 4 academic public high schools in Washington, D.C., 1 black and 3 white. In standardized tests given that year, students in the black high school averaged higher test scores than students in 2 of the 3 white high schools. Today, more than a century later, it would be considered utopian even to set that as a goal, much less expect it to actually happen. Yet what happened back in 1899 was no isolated fluke. That same school repeatedly equaled or exceeded national norms on standardized tests in the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s. Back in the 1890s, it was called the M Street School, and in 1916, it was renamed Dunbar High School. When this information on Dunbar High School was first published in the 1970s, those few educators who responded at all dismissed the relevance of these findings by saying that these were middle-class children, and therefore their experience was not relevant to the education of low-income minority children. Those who said this had no factual data on the incomes or occupations of the parents of these children. And the data over the entire 85-year history of academic success in this school, from 1870 to 1955, most of its graduates went on to higher education. This was very unusual for either black or white high school graduates during that era. Because these were usually low-income students, most went to a local free teachers' college or to relatively inexpensive Howard University. But significant numbers won scholarships to leading colleges and universities elsewhere. Early in the 20th century, some M Street School graduates began going to Harvard, the first in 1903, and other academically elite colleges. A French educator who visited the M Street School that year described its students as pursuing the same studies as our average college student. During the period from 1918 to 1923, graduates of this school went on to earn 25 degrees from Ivy League colleges, Amherst, Williams, and Wellesley. At one time during this era, there were 9 black students at Amherst, 6 from Dunbar High School. Over the period from 1892 to 1954, Amherst admitted 34 graduates of the M Street School and Dunbar. Of these, 74% graduated from Amherst, and 28% of these graduates were Phi Beta Kappas. Nor was Amherst unique. Dunbar graduates also became Phi Beta Kappas at Harvard, Yale, Williams, Cornell, Dartmouth, and other elite institutions. At one time, the reputation of Dunbar graduates was such that they did not have to take entrance examinations to be admitted to Dartmouth, Harvard, and some other selective colleges. When Robert N. Mattingly graduated from the M Street School in 1902, he entered Amherst College, receiving credit for freshman mathematics and first-year college physics, and he graduated in 3 years Phi Beta Kappa. Yet, far from being one of the elite, Mattingly was, in his own words, at Amherst on a shoestring. No systematic study has been made of the later careers of the graduates of M Street and Dunbar High School. However, when black educator Horace Mann Bond studied the backgrounds of blacks with PhDs in 1970, he discovered that more of them had graduated from M Street Dunbar than from any other black high school in the country. The first black who pioneered in a number of fields also came from this school. The first black man to graduate from Annapolis came from Dunbar. The first black enlisted man in the Army to rise to become a commissioned officer also came from this same institution. So did the first black woman to receive a PhD from an American university. So did the first black full professor at a major American university, Allison Davis at the University of Chicago. So did the first black federal judge, the first black general, the first black cabinet. Many, if not most, predominantly minority schools have performed very poorly, but enough others have not that this cannot be blamed simply on their being racially segregated schools. Not only did M Street Dunbar High School have a racially segregated student body throughout the 85 years of its academic success, so did St. Augustine's School, a Catholic high school in New Orleans, which also met national standards in its early history. The first black student from the South to win a National Merit Scholarship came from St. Augustine. So did the first presidential scholar of any race from the state of Louisiana. When St. Augustine was studied back in the 1970s, 20% of all presidential scholars in the history of the state had come from this one school with about 600 black students. Test scores were never used as a rigid cutoff for admission to St. Augustine. There were students there with IQs in the 60s, as well as others with IQs more than twice that high. Moreover, the average IQ of the school as a whole rose over the years, being in the 80s and 90s in the 1950s, and then reaching the national average of 100 in the 1960s. To put that in perspective, both blacks and whites in the South during this era tended to score below the national average on IQ and other standardized tests. By contrast, with a private Catholic high school like St. Augustine, PS 91 in Brooklyn, New York, was a public elementary school located in a rundown ghetto and housed in an even older building than the original Dunbar High School. Yet the students in most of the grades in this predominantly black school scored at or above the national norms on standardized tests when I studied it back in the 1970s. It was the only school in its district whose students were reading at or above the national average. The next best school in that district had fewer than 40% of its students reading at or above national norms, and a number of other schools in the district had fewer than 30% who reached that level. This was not in any sense a middle-class school or a magnet school. It was just an ordinary ghetto school run by an extraordinary principal. What was more extraordinary to me than even the test scores of the students was the openness with which I was welcomed and allowed to see whatever I wanted to see. Educators often like to give guided tours to selected and often atypical places, much like the Potemkin village tours in Tsarist Russia. But in PS 91, I was allowed to wander down the halls and arbitrarily pick out which classrooms I wanted to go into. I did this on every floor of the school. Inside those classrooms were black children, much like children you can find in any ghetto across the country. Many came from broken homes and were on welfare. Yet, inside this school, they spoke in grammatical English, in complete sentences, and to the point. Many of the materials they were studying were a year or more. The principal of Bennett Q Elementary School in Inglewood, California, whose student body is 52% Hispanic and 45% Black, raised these children's reading levels from the 3rd percentile to the 50th percentile in just 4 years. But she was threatened with the loss of money because she used phonics instead of the mandated whole language teaching methods and taught exclusively in English instead of using the bilingual approach required by education authorities. The fact that she was succeeding where others were failing carried no weight with state education officials. Fortunately, it carried enough weight with the parents of her students that they bombarded these officials with protests that caused them to relent and let this principal continue to succeed in her own way, instead of failing in their way. In Houston, Texas, students in Wesley Elementary School, 92% Black and 7% Hispanic, were reading several years below grade level before a new principal installed a new curriculum and raised their reading and math scores above the national average. But again, the methods he used were not those favored by the education establishment, which tried to stop him. Fortunately, a new district superintendent, Rod Page, later U.S. Secretary of Education, was more supportive, so that the success of this school and these methods continued under a new principal who said bluntly, "The teachers' colleges are to blame for so much school failure." Educational success usually provides no protection from the wrath of those who impose their educational dogmas on the schools and will not tolerate seeing those dogmas ignored. High school math teacher Jaime Escalante, whose successes in teaching Mexican American students was celebrated in the movie Stand and Deliver, was eventually hounded out of Garfield High School in Los Angeles. Yet while he was there, about 1/4 of all Mexican American students in the entire country who passed advanced placement calculus came from Garfield High School. Documented results are not allowed to override the prevailing educational dogmas, which pervade the schools of education, the teachers' unions, and state and federal education bureaucracies, none of whom pays the price for the failure of these dogmas. Neither do their children, who are typically enrolled in private schools. What they would have to pay a price for would be widespread demonstrations that the methods to which they are committed produce educational results that are grossly inferior to those produced by the methods they oppose. Should such revelations become widely known among parents and voters, this would threaten not only their careers, but also their agendas. which include the use of public schools to promote fashionable beliefs and attitudes, political correctness, rather than to equip students' minds with knowledge and develop their capacity for independent use of logic and evidence. None of this says that there is just one best. Not only is this the opposite of the approach used by education experts, so is the KIPP rejection of any single magic formula for teaching. KIPP teachers are free to teach as they see fit, so long as they get results. These teachers also visit parents in their homes to explain what they are doing and what the parents need to do. And they carry cell phones with toll-free numbers so that they can be reached after school hours. They mean business. Many other successful minority schools, too numerous to mention, are operating in various communities around the country. 21 of them were studied by the Heritage Foundation under its No Excuses program. To be eligible for this program, a school must score at or above the 65th percentile on national achievement tests, and 75% of their students must qualify for the subsidized or free lunch program. Most schools where such a high percentage of students come from homes with low enough incomes to qualify for this lunch program score below the 35th percentile. Yet the 21 schools that met the No Excuses program criteria and whose results were published were by no means the only such schools, just the ones that happened to be found in the survey that was conducted. What are the secrets of such successful schools? The biggest secret is that there are no secrets, unless work is a secret. Work seems to be the only four-letter word that cannot be used in public today. Aside from work and discipline, the various successful schools for minority children have had little in common with one another, and even less in common with the fashionable educational theories of our times. Some of these schools have been public, some private. Some have been secular, and some have been religious. Dunbar High School had an all-black teaching staff, but St. Augustine in New Orleans began with an all-white teaching staff. Some of these schools were housed in old, run-down buildings, and others in new, modern facilities. Some of their principals were finely attuned to the social and political nuances, while others were blunt people who could not have cared less about such things and would have failed Public Relations 1. Myths and tragedies. Some of the myths surrounding the education of Black students have already been noted in passing. That only middle-class youngsters can do well on standardized tests, that racially separate schools are inherently inferior, and that standardized tests are too culturally biased to predict the academic or later success of Black students. There are many other myths, and they all contribute to the tragedies that afflict the education of most Black students. More than isolated false beliefs are involved, however. Most of these beliefs reflect an overall vision and an agenda that need to be scrutinized. The racial mix. Perhaps the most widespread and most consequential of these myths, promulgated despite bans on education for Blacks in the antebellum South, and by no means universal access of Blacks to public schools in the North. The census of 1850 showed that most of the approximately 500,000 free Blacks could read and write. After emancipation, the achievement of literacy by a majority of Black Americans within 2 generations has been called an accomplishment seldom witnessed in human history by a noted economic historian. Literacy may be something that we take for granted today, but most of the people in Albania were still illiterate in the 1920s, and most of the people in India were still illiterate half a century after that. But how and why literacy was achieved among Black Americans as rapidly as it was is a matter of little or no interest to those who treat the history of Blacks as the history of white people's treatment of Blacks. Thus, the history of the education of Blacks in the United States is presented largely as a history of segregated schools, starved for funds, and of biases against Black students by white teachers, or by white students in racially integrated settings, or other such things which transform the history of Black people into a history of white people and their treatment of Blacks. History is too often the handmaiden of contemporary visions or agendas. Accomplishments among Blacks are often either magnified or downplayed, or glided over entirely, according to whether these accomplishments do or do not advance the agenda of portraying victimhood or struggles against victimhood. In this context, it is explicable, though hardly justified, that the history of successful Black schools has attracted virtually no interest from either historians or educators. That history does not advance any contemporary political agenda, though it might help advance the education of a whole generation of Black students. Things that do advance contemporary agendas include demands for money to promote the teaching of Black English or Ebonics. Here, there is much appeal to history, though largely a fictitious history. The peculiarities of ghetto speech, often imitated even among contemporary Black middle-class youth, are said to derive from African speech patterns, when in fact, most of those very same words and phrases were part of the speech patterns in those parts of Britain from which white Southerners came centuries ago. False history is not unique to Black Americans. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan said of his fellow Irish Americans, the cruel part of this history is that by 1916, Irish nationalism in America had little to do with Ireland. It was a hodgepodge of fine feeling and bad history with which the immigrants filled a cultural void. Much of what calls itself Afrocentric education is similarly remote from Africa and is similarly filling a cultural void. But now there is huge political support for such things, and that has brought forth an exception was Booker T. Washington, who was born in bondage during the last years of slavery, and who in adulthood was preoccupied with the education of others like himself from the Black masses, rather than the education of the offspring of the more cultured Black elite, such as W.E.B. Du Bois. It would be hard to understand these two men's real differences, as distinguished from the caricatures about them produced in later generations, without understanding the very different constituencies they served. Colleges specifically for Blacks were established after the Civil War, but most were essentially white institutions for Black students, given the scarcity of Blacks with the educational qualifications to become professors. Indeed, the scarcity of Black students qualified to be in college often meant, in the 19th century, that many of these colleges were essentially elementary and secondary schools by another name. For example, of the 251 students attending Atlanta University in academic year 1872-73, only 12 were taking college courses, while 128 were taking elementary school courses. Over the first quarter century of its existence, fewer than 5% of Atlanta University students took college-level courses. Nor was Atlanta University unique. In order to understand this early era of Black higher education, it is necessary to understand the extreme scarcity of Black students who had received the preparatory education required for real college education. The first public high school for Black children in America was established in 1870, the Washington School that later became known as Dunbar High School. 22 years later, the first public high school for Blacks in Baltimore was founded. As late as school year 1915-16, there were just 64 public high schools for Black children in all 18 southern states put together, with more than half of these high schools being in just 4 states: West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Texas. A survey of 16 southern and border states, plus the District of Columbia, showed a grand total of fewer than 9,000 Black students enrolled in public secondary schools in 1916. A federal government report on Black students noted at that time, while only a fourth of the secondary pupils in the border states are educated at private expense, almost 2/3 of those in the other southern states are in private institutions. The states of the Deep South were the most reluctant to build public high schools for Black children. During the 1920s, behind-the-scenes pressure was necessary to get a public high school for Blacks built in Atlanta, and as late as the 1930s, only 7% of Black youngsters of high school age were attending high school in Mississippi. Writing in 1944, Gunnar Myrdal noted, "High schools for Negroes in the South have existed in significant numbers for only about 20 years and are still inadequate." The situation would have been even more bleak than it was. He served on the board of trustees for Howard University and Fisk University, whose educational missions were very different from that of Tuskegee Institute, and he used his influence to get financial support for Howard and other Black academic institutions, such as Talladega College and Atlanta University. He declared, "I would say to the Black boy what I would say to the white boy. Get all the mental development that your time and pocketbook will allow of," though he saw most Blacks of his time as needing to acquire practical work skills first. "Still," he said, "I would not have the standard of mental development lowered one whit, for with the Negro, as with all races, mental strength is the basis of all progress." Kelly Miller saw the controversy over differences in educational philosophy to be the work of one-eyed enthusiasts rather than of men like Du Bois and Washington, who saw the need for both. Booker T. Washington saw his own primary task as the promotion of progress among the many and not the special culture of the few. He saw his work as an educator in his times as preparatory, as laying a foundation for the masses, but not to confine the whole race to the work for which Tuskegee Institute would immediately prepare its students. After speaking proudly of a Tuskegee graduate whose knowledge of chemistry had increased the acreage yield of sweet potatoes several-fold, he said, "My theory of education for the Negro would not, for example, confine him for all time to farm work, to the production of the best and most sweet potatoes, but that, if he succeeded in this line of industry, he could lay the foundations upon which his children and grandchildren could grow to higher and more important things in life. Even in the present," he said, "we need professional men and women," and he looked forward to a time when there would be more successful Black lawyers, congressmen, and music teachers. As regards civil rights, although Booker T. Washington wrote in 1899, "I do not favor the Negro's giving up anything which is fundamental and which has been guaranteed to him by the Constitution of the United States," his general public posture was that he was too busy with the self-improvement of Blacks to become involved in political controversies. Yet, when his papers were examined after his death, it became clear that he had privately goaded other Blacks to crusade for civil rights, and had even secretly financed legal challenges to the Jim Crow laws in the South. Washington was fully aware that to have done these things publicly would have jeopardized the white financial support on which Tuskegee Institute depended. Nor was this simply a matter of protecting his own interests. He understood the repercussions for others if he made explosive statements in the volatile racial atmosphere of the times. "I could stir up a race war in Alabama in 6 weeks if I chose," he said, "but to do so would wipe out the achievements of decades of labor." Yet he also understood. Fraser described the new Black college students as listless and less concerned with the history or understanding of the world around them than with their appearance at the next social affair. Moreover, such concerns were supported by the new generation of administrators. The girl with a peasant or working class background may be irritated by her mother's inability to buy an expensive party dress. But what can be expected when the Dean of Women has instructed her to tell her mother that she must have the dress at any sacrifice? As for the faculty, Professor Fraser described them this way in the middle of the 20th century. "Unlike the missionary teachers, the present teachers have little interest in making men, but are concerned primarily with teaching as a source of income, which will enable them to maintain middle-class standards and participate in Negro society. It appears that the majority of them have no knowledge of books nor any real love of literature. Today, many of the teachers of English and literature never read a book as a source of pleasure or recreation." In short, the Black colleges retrogress toward the Black redneck culture. The stultifying and anti-intellectual atmosphere on many Black college campuses has been described with painful frankness in Professor Fraser's 1958 book, Black Bourgeoisie, by Black novelist Ralph Ellison in Invisible Man, and by white scholars Christopher Jenks and David Reisman in a comprehensive 1967 article in the Harvard Educational Review, which may well have been the last honest study of Black colleges, given the rising racial militancy and the automatic labeling of white critics as racists. There have been no Black college equivalents of Dunbar High School or other high-achieving Black elementary and secondary schools. One major historic difference between Black colleges and Dunbar High School was the highly qualified, if not overqualified, early leadership of Dunbar and the underqualified first generation of Black leadership of the Black colleges, the latter put in place for purposes of symbolic racial representation. There were enduring consequences to the different calibers of people who shaped these different institutions in their formative stages and set in motion values and priorities which shaped and selected their successors in the generations ahead. In a much later era, beginning in the 1960s, a similar setting up of Black studies departments at predominantly white colleges across the country, with little or no regard to the wholly inadequate numbers of academically qualified people to staff so many departments established simultaneously, likewise put in place a first generation of Black academics who would lead such departments in non-academic or even anti-intellectual directions. Even though there was no inherent reason why the scholarly study of the history, economics, politics, or sociology of Black Americans could not be a serious enterprise. In practice, education was a major factor in this as well. As of 1940, non-white males averaged just 5.4 years of schooling, compared to 8.7 for white males. Over the next 2 decades, the absolute amount of education increased for both, and the gap between them narrowed. In 1940, the difference in schooling between Black and white young adult males, aged 25 to 29, was 4 years, but by 1960, that had shrunk to less than 2 years. Because this was an era of massive Black migration out of the South, this quantitative narrowing of the gap in schooling may well have been accompanied by a qualitative improvement, as many Blacks left behind the low-quality schools in the Jim Crow South. How did this translate into economic change? As of 1940, more than 4/5 of Black families, 87% in fact, lived below the official poverty level. By 1960, this had fallen to 47%. In other words, the poverty rate among Blacks had been nearly cut in half before either the Civil Rights Revolution or the Great Society social programs began in the 1960s. The continuation of this trend can hardly be automatically credited to these political developments, though such claims are often made, usually ignoring the pre-existing trends whose momentum could hardly have been expected to stop in the absence of such legislation. By 1970, the poverty rate among Blacks had fallen to 30%, a welcome development, but by no means unprecedented. A decade after that, with the rise of affirmative action in the intervening years, the poverty rate among Black families had fallen to 29%. Even if one attributes all of this 1% decline to government policy, it does not compare to the dramatic declines in poverty among Blacks when the only major change was the rise in their education. Whatever the merits of various movements and programs on other grounds, the claim that they were the primary factor in the economic advancement of Blacks cannot be squared with the facts. Yet a whole generation of Black leaders, intellectuals, and activists had become committed to such movements and programs and their accompanying rhetoric. However, Frederick Douglass warned, as far back as the 1870s, that Blacks should cultivate their brains more and their lungs less. While no one can deny the existence of racial discrimination in employment, housing, and other areas, the assumption that the magnitude of employment discrimination can be measured by relative numbers of Blacks in particular occupations ignores the huge quantitative and qualitative differences in education between Blacks and whites which existed in past generations, often as a result of government discrimination in the provision of educational resources. Without an understanding of the reasons for both the lags and the progress, history versus visions. It requires courage to cast the accumulated myths of a lifetime to the wind. Our national desire for simplicity, certitude, and the approval of others occasionally causes us to defend even our most flawed worldviews as if our very lives depended on them. Dead belief systems are difficult to bury, for in doing so we enter a world we do not recognize. We watch the carefully crafted towers of our understanding crash down in ruins, and we lose an integral piece of the only reality we have known, reinforced and imprinted on our minds by 1,000 voices, internal and external. John Perazzo. Nowhere has history been more in thrall to belief systems, visions, than in the history of racial and ethnic groups. Too often the past has been twisted to fit the visions and the agendas of the present. Much of the history written about minority groups has in fact been a history of how others treated these groups, more so than a history of the groups themselves. This bias has distorted both the histories of racial and ethnic groups and the histories of the societies in which they have lived. Black Americans are just one of the groups whose history has been seen in this strange and twisted way as a commentary on American society, and an opportunity to score ideological points or promote guilt or gain some contemporary political advantage. Mention Japanese Americans and internment camps come up. Mention Mexican Americans, and the things suffered by them or by Mexico are sure to become the focus of discussion. Injustices should not be swept under the rug, but whole peoples are more than the sum of the injustices they have suffered. At least they should be seen as more, if history is truly to be history and not just the projection into the past of contemporary visions and agendas. Where world history is concerned, the same skewed approach has too often prevailed. Few things attract less attention than the achievements of the West, which have improved the lives of peoples around the world through medical science, technology, and economic organizations more effective at producing the material output on which people depend for food, shelter, and the comforts and amenities of life. Those who warn against being Eurocentric are themselves often the most Eurocentric of all when it comes to assigning blame for slavery, imperialism, wars, and other human tragedies that have originated on every inhabited continent at one period of history or another. Multiculturalism has not meant warts and all portraits of different societies around the world. For many, it has meant virtually a warts-only portrait of the West and a no-warts portrait of non-Western peoples. More is involved than a simple The straightforward meaning of prejudice, prejudgment, is, in an ethnic or racial context, stretched and twisted to mean any adverse opinion about a minority group. This implicitly assumes that any unfavorable judgment about the behavior or performance of any minorities cannot have any factual basis, and so can only be explained as being a result of a prejudgment. But when German Jews in America were socially accepted into many elite circles from which all Jews were later barred, after an influx of Eastern European Jews, the origins of these barriers cannot have been anti-Jewish prejudice as such, though the persistence of such barriers long after Eastern European Jews had become acculturated to American society shows the weight of inertia. Similarly, Blacks lived in white neighborhoods in many northern cities in the late 19th century, and their children went to racially integrated schools before the massive influx of Blacks from the South at the beginning of the 20th century. Can the change to racial segregation in both housing and schools be attributed to prejudice or to experience? To say that it must have been prejudice is itself a prejudgment. Again, inertia would cause these adverse reactions to outlast the circumstances which gave rise to them and to apply to individuals quite different from those whose behavior provoked racial barriers in the first place. Blacks are by no means the only ethnic group whose advancement has been promoted by its own internal transformations, with greater acceptance by the surrounding population being an effect, more so than a cause, of the group's advancement. Acculturated German Jews who had achieved respectability and social acceptance in 19th century America lamented the arrival of masses of Eastern European Jews who were far less acculturated, less educated, and were often poverty-stricken. The German Jews' fear, which proved to be well-founded, was that the arrival of huge numbers of such people, foreign in appearance and repellent in behavior to American society at large, would lead to hostility and barriers against all Jews. This understanding led, among other things, to organized attempts by German Jews to assimilate the Eastern European Jews to American standards of behavior, cleanliness, and lifestyle. This internal transformation of the Jewish population led over the years to lessening hostility and greater acceptance by the American population as a whole. Again, this did not mean that there were no inveterate anti-Semites who would be hostile to Jews in spite of anything that the latter could do. But neither can hostility to Jews after the arrival of vast numbers from Eastern Europe be explained as simply an arbitrary prejudice, especially coming after German Jews had already been accepted, even in the higher reaches of society. In the case of immigrants from Ireland, the massive efforts of the Catholic Church in the 19th, but these peaks are not planned for, and they do not serve to level up the general standard of living. In the Cotton Belt, luxuries are likely to be bought on the spur of the moment during a good season in cotton, and to be paid for in the poverty of next year's living. One can neither exercise a systematic thrift, budget expenses, nor indulge in installment buying on irregular returns from cotton. This ignores the fact that the ancestors of these people lived in the same spur-of-the-moment way on the other side of the Atlantic, in places where cotton did not grow. But once an external explanation of behavior is available, Internal explanations are seldom sought, and weighing the two against one another is rarer still. That is what is meant by saying that the prevailing vision is the default setting for many. Poverty is one of the most widely used external explanations of intergroup differences, but, like other external explanations, it is seldom tested empirically against alternative internal explanations. Many poorer groups lag in intellectual development, but others do not. As noted in an earlier essay, poor Jewish immigrants in the early 20th century made use of free public libraries in New York, and the books they checked out were primarily serious works, while lighter and more popular books were left gathering dust on the library shelves. Among their ancestors in Eastern Europe a century earlier, even the poorest somehow managed to have books in their homes, while the larger population around them were overwhelmingly illiterate. A similar pattern was found among the people in 18th century Scotland. Even a person of relatively modest means had his own collection of books, and what he couldn't afford, he could get at the local lending library, which by 1750, virtually every town of any size enjoyed. At about the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, Thomas Jefferson was complaining that there was not a single bookstore in his vicinity, and a century later, Frederick Law Olmsted commented on how seldom he saw books, even in the homes of Southerners who could have afforded them. Still later, in the 20th century, E. Franklin Frazier commented on how seldom even Black college faculty read books. Nothing better illustrates the dominance of unsubstantiated dogma over empirical evidence than the pervasive belief that the advancement of economically or socially lagging groups requires a sense of group pride, identity, and self-esteem, and that self-hate must be exterminated as a barrier to such advance. The plausibility of this belief is not in question. What is open to very serious question is whether or not it is supported by any hard evidence. Yet such evidence is seldom asked for or given. Putting aside for the moment the emotionally loaded terms of such discussions, is it in fact the case that this era ended dramatically when American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry entered Japanese waters in 1854 and demanded that Japan open its ports to the outside world? Helpless in the face of such overwhelming modern force, Japan had no choice but to submit to this demand. It was a turning point in the country's history. This painful demonstration of Japan's weakness and backwardness before its own people and before the world set in motion internal reforms and an agenda for national development that dominated the country's history for the next century. Japan's leaders in that era held up the West in general, and the United States in particular, as examples to be emulated. Western technology was imported, and Japanese students were sent to study in the West. The English language began to be taught in Japanese schools, and there was even a suggestion at one point that English be made the national language of Japan. Textbooks issued by the Japanese government held up Abraham Lincoln and Benjamin Franklin as models for the young to imitate, even more so than Japanese heroes. There were euphoric descriptions of the United States as an earthly paradise. It would be hard to find a more striking example of the cultural cringe than 19th century Japan. An episode shortly after Americans forced Japan to open up to the outside world illustrates the situation at that time. Commodore Perry presented a train as a gift, and the Americans proceeded to demonstrate it. At first, the Japanese watched the train fearfully from a safe distance, and when the engine began to move, they uttered cries of astonishment and drew in their breath. Before long, they were inspecting it closely, stroking it, and riding on it, and they kept this up throughout the day. No one could have predicted then that, a century later, Japan would produce its own bullet train that surpassed anything available in the United States. But it happened only because the Japanese recognized their own initial backwardness and were determined to overcome it. They began by learning all that they could from the West and emulating the West until they reached the point when they had amassed the knowledge, skill, and experience to take their own independent direction. In the first half of the 20th century, Japanese products were widely known as cheap, inferior imitations of European or American products. Even after Japan later began to produce higher quality products, such as cameras, The first Canon was an imitation of the German Leica, and the first Nikon was an imitation of its German rival, the Contax. Over time, however, these and other Japanese cameras evolved into the leading cameras in the world, both technologically and in terms of sales. Similarly spectacular developments occurred when the Japanese entered the electronics, automotive, and other fields. Clearly, in these and other cases, the minority has simply outperformed the majority population, often in both the educational system and the economic system. Even when it is clear that some groups have excelled without any power to suppress or oppress other groups, there is often still a rankling sense of the injustice of it all, that a child born into one group has so much greater prospects of success in life than a child of no greater innate ability born into another group. Sometimes this is blamed on a lack of social justice, though the causes of such differences extend well beyond things controlled by any society, and which could therefore legitimately be called social. Each group trails the long shadow of its own history and culture, which influence its habits, priorities, and social patterns, which in turn affect its fate. If there is an injustice, it is an injustice which extends beyond the control of any existing government, institution, or society, because it involves the confluences of history, demography, culture, geography, and other factors, including luck. If there is an injustice, it is at this cosmic level in the vagaries of fate. Lamenting the vagaries of fate may leave us with a galling sense of helpless frustration, which many escape by transforming the tragedy of the human condition into the specific sins of specific societies. This turns an insoluble problem of cosmic justice into an apparently more manageable issue of social justice. Since the sins of human beings are virtually inexhaustible, there is seldom a lack of examples of wrongdoing to which intergroup differences can be attributed, rightly or wrongly. Where the quest for injustice is overriding, among the things it overrides are logic and evidence. For example, various kinds of differences between white and Aboriginal Australians were lumped together by a white Australian woman as examples of social injustice. The fact that I wake up each morning in a warm, safe, comfortable home, secure in the knowledge that the schools I send my children off to are organized to enhance their life chances and choices, and that good health, employment opportunities, and respect are the norm, not the goal in our lives, has been made possible through the 208-year exploitation of land that belonged to Indigenous Australians since the beginning of time. Here, differences in life chances are attributed to the seizure of land by the transplanted Europeans who settled Australia. If this were meant seriously as an empirical proposition, rather than as an ideological indictment, then the most obvious question would be, were there no differences in life chances between the Europeans and the Aborigines before they met, when they were each living in their own respective homelands? Are differences today greater than they were then? After the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it was centuries, some estimate a millennium, before the standard of living in Western Europe rose again to the level it had reached in Roman times. The survival of a society or a civilization is not just a question of a preference for one particular set of political or social arrangements over another. It is easy to discuss alternative arrangements around a seminar table as if transformations were no problem, but the painful alternatives amid the ruins can be very different. Europeans lived for centuries with the presence of ruins more magnificent than anything they were capable of creating or even restoring. It is hardly surprising that they looked back at the ancients with awe, long before they developed the modern Western tendency to look forward to greater accomplishments in the future than those of the past or the present. Another modern Western tendency, at least among the intelligentsia, is to be anti-Western, to apply double standards that ignore or excuse behavior in non-Western societies that would be excoriated in the West, or to picture the sins of the human race as if they were peculiarities of our society. Specific examples include the history of conquest, slavery, and war. Conquest. While European imperialism has been dominant in the past 500 years, in the preceding centuries, Europe was itself subjected to foreign conquests. It was invaded from Asia by the Mongols, to whom the Russians paid tribute. It was invaded from the Middle East by the Ottoman Empire, whose armies reached the gates of Vienna in the 16th century. Europe was invaded from North Africa, and the whole Iberian Peninsula was subjugated for centuries by the Moors. There was nothing peculiarly European about either conquering or being conquered, or about changing from one of these roles to the other in the course of history. The year in which the last of the North African conquerors was driven out of Spain, 1492, was the same year that marked the beginning of Europeans' creation of worldwide empires. Conquest, like slavery, existed on every inhabited continent and involved all the races of mankind as both conquerors and subjugated peoples. Slavery and conquest existed in the Western Hemisphere before the first white man set foot on the shores of the Americas. The Zulus were conquering other African peoples when the British arrived in Southern Africa and conquered them all. Europeans also displaced other conquerors in Asia and among the Polynesians. What was different about European imperialism was how widely scattered its empires were, which was possible only because of revolutions in naval technology and a pre-existing base of wealth available to finance overseas expansion. But morally, what the Europeans did was the same as what non-Europeans had been doing for thousands of years. But Western advances in the realm of ideas and institutions have been fundamental as well, though these have not always traveled as well when transplanted into cultures very different from the cultures in which these ideas and institutions evolved over the centuries. Here it may be useful to sketch just two fundamental Western mental products, a universalistic conception of human beings and the rule of law. Perhaps the most important, and certainly the most distinctive, characteristic of Western civilization since at least the 18th century has been a growing universalism. Nothing has been more common among human beings around the world, and for thousands of years of history, than to disregard the troubles inflicted on other people outside the group to which they happen to belong. Some have taken positive pleasure in their ability to dominate, oppress, humiliate, or kill others, as for example Genghis Khan did. The Mayans developed to a high art form both the prolonged tortures and humiliations they heaped upon those they had conquered, and the commemoration of such acts in their art. Nor had such things died out in the 20th century, when the Japanese in World War II delighted in savaging and humiliating American and other prisoners of war, as well as civilians in their conquered territories, and when their Nazi allies found mass slaughter not enough unless it was accomplished by soul-searing degradations inflicted on inmates of their concentration camps. No society thus far has entirely escaped this older tendency. In other words, universalism has not yet become universal in any society, nor did universalism, in terms of having regard for other people's feeling or well-being, imply any sense of equality in ability or even likability. It simply meant that all people deserve to be treated decently and fairly, whomever they might be, and whatever the state of their ability or their culture. Nothing epitomized this universalism more than Queen Victoria's concern about the fate of slaves in other lands. When Uncle Tom's Cabin author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was granted an audience with Her Majesty during a trip to England, she found the Queen able to discuss the Dred Scott case in great detail, as well as saying that she had wept over some of the passages in the novel. There could hardly be a greater social distance than that between the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known and a slave being whipped in another country on the other side of an ocean. Yet this universalism was more than an incidental phenomenon in Western civilization. It fueled a worldwide crusade against slavery for more than a century, and the fact that it took more than a century to destroy slavery over most of the world clearly indicates that this universalism did not prevail outside of Western civilization. One of the implications of universalism is that those who are more fortunate need not be any more deserving than those in misery. For some, this suggests much has been written about the sheer neglect of history in our educational institutions, with students able to graduate from some of the most prestigious colleges in the land without having had a single course in the history of their own country or of the world. Far more insidious and dangerous, however, is the promotion of a history created as a projection into the past of current notions and agendas. History, with its integrity as a record of the past intact, is a goldmine of experience from many times and peoples under a wider range of circumstances than any given generation can find in its own time. Contemporary plans, theories, beliefs, and hopes can be checked against the record of what has happened in the past when similar notions were put into practice. Merely to discover how often the same ideas have occurred to others centuries ago can be a sobering experience for those inclined to become carried away by supposedly new and brilliant insights about an unprecedented situation. But history cannot be a reality check for visions when history is itself shaped by visions. There has been much hand-wringing about the difficulty or impossibility of achieving objectivity in writing history. If there is anyone who is objective, it is hard to imagine how others who are not objective would know that. The unattainability of objectivity is too often a distraction from something more mundane that is quite attainable, but is often absent: honesty. When facts about racial or ethnic groups that are both known and relevant are deliberately suppressed because they would undermine a particular vision, doctrine, or agenda, then history is prostituted and cannot serve as a check against visions, because facts have been subordinated to visions. Objectivity is too often a red herring. No one makes the impossible demand that mathematicians be objective, but that does not mean that the logic of geometry or equations depends on how each individual chooses to look at it. Nor can a mathematician who gets his geometry or equations wrong take refuge in the truism that no one is objective. Neither should historians be able to find refuge in such truisms. None of this denies that there are honest differences in interpreting history, but that in turn cannot deny that there are also dishonest differences. The pretense of looking at history from someone else's point of view, that of the downtrodden or the dispossessed, for example, is just one example. For neither today's author nor reader can achieve such a feat when discussing the past. Taking sides. From the undeniable fact that an individual's personal leanings for or against particular groups, nations, or civilizations can influence the way that individual sees history, some have concluded that it is just a matter of choosing sides when writing history and looking at history from the viewpoint of those whose side one is taking, in many cases turned anti-Jewish and anti-Asian in both words and deeds, including murders of store owners during ghetto riots. The very word racism was then redefined to exclude groups without power, so that the most anti-Semitic rantings or anti-Asian violence committed by blacks was exempted from the term, even though power had never been a prerequisite for defining racism before the need to exempt black racism arose. Reaching conclusions after the fact is not the same as taking sides before the facts, even if those conclusions reflect credit or discredit on different individuals or groups to differing degrees. The historian is the agent of the reader. That is whose side is supposed to be served, and it is a conflict of interest to set out to serve some other cause while pretending to be informing the reader. A hypercritical view of one's own society or civilization may express a sense of personal guilt for the undeserved good fortune of being a member of a society whose economic, political, and social benefits far exceed those available to other people of no less merit who happen to live in other kinds of societies, or in a different social setting within the same society. Wanting to line up on the side of such people may be a generous impulse, but it can also be a dangerous self-indulgence. Such moral partisanship is unlikely to do much good to those unfortunate enough to be born without the social and cultural prerequisites for prosperity or freedom. Whatever chances such people have of acquiring the missing ingredients for their own advancement are reduced to the extent that their problems are misdiagnosed as the sins of other people, rather than things that they themselves lack, even if they lack those things for reasons beyond their control. Often the things they lack can be acquired sooner and more extensively than they can either reform other people or get the society as a whole to provide for them through a redistribution of existing wealth that they are capable of producing for themselves through an upgrading of their own productivity. Moreover, rising productivity adds to the net wealth of the society and the world, which is more likely to gain the respect of others, as well as self-respect, than our reiterated pleas or demands for a share of what others have created. Looking at history as a matter of taking sides encourages the collectivization of people, not only as of a given time, but also over time, so that Germans or Czechs, for example, become intertemporal abstractions. This creates not only intellectual problems, but even more painful and sometimes catastrophic practical problems in the real world. For example, the confiscation of the lands of Czech nobles who revolted against the Habsburg Empire in 1620 meant a transfer of vast amounts of land to people of German ancestry, a process which leaders of such tendencies have only increased since then. Such automatic group solidarity ties the fate of the community as a whole to the fate of its most unsavory elements in many ways. It not only identifies the community with the acts of these individuals in the eyes of the larger society, it puts great leverage in the hands of irresponsible and criminal elements whose actions can cause backlashes against Blacks in general, whether in the form of political reactions, social isolation, violence, or simply the withdrawal of businesses from Black neighborhoods, taking jobs and a tax base with them. Where a particular group culture is itself a handicap impeding the acquisition of the education, skills, and experience required for economic and other advancement, group solidarity can have huge and lifelong consequences with staggering costs. Even with such mundane things as the prices charged in local stores, group solidarity can obscure the causes of the higher prices which often confront lower income people. The costs created by crime and violence are often blamed on outsiders who charge these high prices, rather than on the local delinquent and criminal elements that create the costs which these prices reflect. Group solidarity may not only seal a group off from the larger surrounding society, it may offer the truth about the internal causes of their own problems, making a solution more remote. The prevailing vision is one of a solidified minority in a stance of defiance against the larger society, with minority leaders and activists ever ready to protest police actions against any members of the community. Outside intellectuals, celebrities, politicians, judges, and others who see racial and ethnic issues as a matter of taking sides may also adopt this posture in order to be on the side of the minority community, perhaps in order to atone for their own good fortune. But such a stance and such a vision impose great costs on the community that they intend to help, though these outsiders pay no part of any of those costs, and so have little or no incentive to scrutinize their social vision and its assumptions to discover their actual effects. One of the subsidiary notions growing out of group solidarity is that of role models. Efforts to find, praise, or exaggerate the numbers and achievements of these role models can be counterproductive by insinuating the idea that people can be inspired only by others who physically resemble themselves. But history has repeatedly demonstrated the falsity of that notion. Japan went from being a backward feudal society to becoming a modern industrial nation by learning from Europeans and Americans, both by sending their students to study in Europe and the United States, and by bringing Europeans and Americans to Japan to teach the needed skills or to provide the industrial experience required to launch. None of this would have been known if the taboo on IQ research had not been defied. And much.
All right, for those of you who have made it the long journey through that information, I'm going to share with you who the writer of this particular information is. I got a little 10-minute clip of an interview where he talks about the book. So let's get into it and see how many of you figured it out.
Like, I mean, the average of Black kid today, I think, is probably better off, certainly materially, than say Ben Carson was when he was growing up.
Ben Carson, the famous Black surgeon at Johns Hopkins,
right.
Who is immensely accomplished in every way.
Yes,
right.
I would say that certainly the Black kids who are growing up today have a higher material standard of living than I had. The difference was that the schools were good when I came along. They were especially good in New York at that time, hard as that is to believe. But the kids who grew up in that same place where I live, they will not get that same education. Now that can be blamed on somebody, but it has very little to do with what happened 100 or 200 years ago. And it's true in other countries. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, there's a tribe, the Igbos, who are living in one of the least fertile parts of Nigeria, who were in fact enslaved in centuries past by other tribes and so on. When the British moved in and set up schools, the Igbos went for the schools. By the time Nigeria became independent, the Igbos had climbed above the other groups that had been ahead of them to begin with. But there are all kinds of cross currents of factors, the particular culture, of the particular geography. You run through the whole list of them.
You cite in Intellectuals and Race, you cite an observation by the intelligence expert, IQ scientist James Flynn, that just stopped me cold. After the Second World War, you've got large numbers of American troops remaining in Germany. For that matter, there's still several tens of thousands there today. And both black and white American soldiers had children with German women. And Flynn discovered that those children growing up in Germany showed no IQ differences at all. The black kids and the white kids, the same. Quoting Intellectuals and Race, Professor Flynn concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany, and now you're quoting Professor Flynn, grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote. Which means what? Which means they experienced exactly the same expectations. Is this
No, the expectations are external. The culture in which they grew up was not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So there's
no gangster rap that was pervasively available in Germany.
So here's what I'm getting. There is something about black subculture in America today that holds African Americans themselves back.
Yes. In fact, I went into this in a previous book, which black rednecks and white liberals, because that same subculture.
Let's talk about two of your books here. Go ahead.
Because that very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.
All right. And so whose job is it to say, wrong subculture, folks, you're harming yourselves?
Well, I would think in an ideal world that intellectuals might take on that task. But the world that we live in, I've noticed, is not ideal.
All right. What is to be done? Take a look at President Lyndon Johnson speaking at Howard University in 1965.
Oh, yes.
But freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair.
It's pathetic. It's not a question of, there's no you who has the control to be completely fair or completely unfair. I mean, the circumstances are, so someone once criticized the mental test on grounds that the tests were unfair. And I think it was David Reisman who said, the tests are not unfair. Life is unfair, and the tests are measuring the results. But who has control of life? Who has control of the past? Who has control of the culture that people have in the present, which they've inherited from the past?
So Lyndon Johnson, in fact, although good liberal that he was, at least in regard, Lyndon Johnson had a complicated career and changed positions on issues many times. But good liberal though he was at that moment, he was in fact engaging in a breathtaking arrogance.
Yes.
On two counts. One, that white people were the ones who were responsible for where black people stood in the race, that it was up to whites entirely. That blacks, as he described, I'm
devastating.
Black people are passive, they're acted upon.
That's right, that's right.
And then the second act of arrogance is the supposition that somehow the federal government could fix it.
Yes, it is staggering. But if you wanted to be charitable, you could say, well, he said this in 1965. But if you say, all right, why are people now repeating it in 2013 when we've had nearly half a century of experience to the contrary? And if you look within the black community, those blacks who had escaped what I call the black redneck culture, they've moved on. So, but it's the culture the different parts of the black community had. They were different.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in his famous 1965 report entitled "The Negro Family: The Case for National Action," close quote. Longish quotation, but it gets to something, I believe. Moynihan: the fundamental problem is that of family structure. The Negro family in the urban ghettos is crumbling. A middle class has managed to save itself, but for vast numbers of the unskilled and poorly educated, the fabric of conventional social relationships has all but disintegrated. So long as this situation persists, the cycle of poverty and disadvantage will continue to repeat itself, close quote. When Moynihan wrote those words, the illegitimacy rate among African Americans was 25%. Today, the illegitimacy rate among white Americans is 36%. Among Hispanics, more than 50%, and among African Americans, more than 70%.
Yeah.
Aside from throwing up your hands in despair, what is to be done?
The first thing to be done is to understand that this was a result of policies begun in the 1960s. This is not a legacy of what happened 100 years before the 1960s.
The breakdown of the black family is not a legacy of slavery.
No, if you the classic study of this goes all the way back to the era of slavery, and they find that most black kids, even under slavery, had lived with two parents, and that was true all the way up until the 1960s. And so, if you really want to find out what has happened, what's changed, it has changed since the 1960s. And the fact that whites now have a higher rate of illegitimacy than blacks had when Moynihan wrote suggests that this is something that spreads out. But if you look at something else, if you look at those blacks, look at black husband-wife families, the poverty rate among such families has been in single digits every year since 1994. And so if you look at the external causes, why the husband and wife families and the welfare single mom families all are facing the same society and objective things, but the results are radically different because the cultures and values are different.
So you would roll back welfare. I guess that's the principal policy. So what would Tom Sowell do? One, you'd eliminate welfare, you'd reform welfare. What would you do?
Roll it back.
All right. And what about affirmative action?
Eliminate it.
Just gone.
Yeah.
Colorblind policy completely. All right. What prospect for that do you see?
None.
No black leader of any standing. I'm talking about a political leader as opposed to an intellectual such as yourself. You've got, there's you, there's Walter Williams. Do you get the sense that there's a growing generation, a rising generation of African American intellectuals who say, enough of this, I'm with Tom Sowell?
Well, I don't know if they'll go that far. There's no point.
That would be asking a lot.
There's no point being reckless. But I think there are people like Shelby Steele, and many others. Larry Elder, you run through a long list. And there are more such people now than there were, say, in the 1970s. But in terms of political leaders, all the incentives politically are for Black leaders to blame all problems in the Black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the Black community against enemies, which in turn creates the situation in which many Blacks don't feel that anything that they do is going to help themselves unless it's done politically as a group. That there's no point. I mean, why would you, if you believe what they say, why would you want to knock yourself out in school, knowing that the man is not going to let you get anywhere? Well, one of the most pathetic things I heard in recent years was a young Black man saying that, at one point he thought he would join the Air Force and become a pilot. And then he says he realized that the white man is not going to let a Black man become a pilot. And he was saying this decades after the Tennessee Airmen had established their reputation in combat in Europe. But the hopelessness is one of the big products of the race industry. That you have no chance. I remember giving a talk at Marquette, and at the end of the talk, among the questions that was asked, a young Black man got up and he said, "Even though I am graduating from Marquette University, what hope is there for me?" And having gone through college when I was in the 50s, I don't remember any Blacks saying that in the 1950s, when there was a lot more obstacles to overcome than there were when this guy is graduating from Marquette. But you have to produce that kind of feeling in order to serve the interests of those in the race industry.
Final question then. Maybe we can think in terms of that young man at Marquette. Or let's put it this way. Somewhere watching this interview, there's a young Thomas Sowell. There's an African American who's smart and wants to do something with his life. It seems to me we've already got one piece of advice you'd offer to him is stay away from the races industry. Stay away from the what advice, race hustlers. What advice would you give a young Thomas Sowell? How do you make something of yourself as an African American in America today?
The way anybody else would. You equip yourself with skills that people are willing to pay for.
Boom, I'm going to stop right there. That's a quote directly from Booker T. Washington. Equip yourself with skills that will make you useful, not only local or national, but globally useful. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. All this begging for reparations and welfare. You know what Farrakhan said about welfare? It's another way of saying farewell.